Good morning. Welcome everyone to the 11th meeting in 2016 of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. Could I remind everyone present to switch off their mobile phones? Apologies have been received from Jamie Green and Mike Rumbles, Mike Rumbles will be turning up later, hopefully sooner rather than later. This morning, our first three agenda items relate to crofting. The first two relate to an affirmative SSI on crofting commission elections, which we will take evidence on our review of crofting law priorities. After which we'll take evidence on our review on crofting law priorities. At agenda item 1, the committee will take evidence on the draft Crofting Commission Elections Scotland Amendment Regulations 2016. And I welcome Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Connectivity, and Gordon Jackson, Head of Agricultural Development and Croftings for the Scottish Government, and indeed Judith Brown, who's a solicitor acting on behalf of the Scottish Government. This instrument is laid under an affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before the provisions can come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider a motion to approve the instrument. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary, please, to make an opening statement regarding this?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to everyone. I'm pleased to be here this morning to support the committee's consideration of the draft Crofting Commission Elections Scotland Amendment Regulations 2016. These regulations are made by Scottish ministers in accordance with powers conferred by paragraph 7.1 of Schedule 1 of the Crofters Scotland Act 1993. I'll provide a brief overview, if I may, and outline the reasons why the amendment regulations have been prepared. Thereafter, my officials, Gordon Jackson and Judith Brown, and I will answer questions. These regulations amend the Crofting Commission Elections Scotland Regulations 211, the Principal Regulations, which set out the arrangements under which elections to the Crofting Commission are conducted. And of course, a member of this committee, Stuart Stevenson, as the then Minister for Environment and Climate Change, was responsible for the 2011 regulations. Not that I mention that in any way to pass the buck. The amendments to the Principal 211 regulations relate to candidate eligibility, absent and proxy votes, the filling of vacancies, the retention of documents, election expenses, and consequential amendments to and revocations of provisions of the Principal regulations. And I'll cover each, if I may. There's quite a lot to cover, but I'll try and be as brief as possible. On candidate eligibility, the 211 regs set out the grounds on which a person is disqualified from being a candidate at an election. This includes disqualification where a person is found by the Commission to be in breach of the residency duty, that's living within 32 kilometres of the croft, without having obtained consent from the Crofting Commission. The amending regulations add further grounds of disqualification from being a candidate. This applies to persons the Commission has decided are failing to comply with duties under the Act to not misuse or neglect their croft and cultivate and maintain their croft. This places all three duties, residency, misuse and cultivation, on an equal footing in terms of candidate eligibility to stand for election. Second, with regard to absent and proxy votes, the regs allow voters to have their ballot paper sent to an address other than their registered address, the absent voters list. They also allow voters to have their ballot paper sent to a proxy, the proxy list. And the regulations place a deadline on when a voter can make such arrangements. However, voters can also apply to be removed from the absent voters and proxy lists, and the Principal regs place no deadline on this. The amending regulations introduce a deadline, and this is conveners to avoid scope for errors in the issuing of ballot papers. This new deadline provides the registration officer with a week in which to amend the Crofting electoral register, which it must supply to the returning officer not later than 4 weeks before the day of the count. The deadline is reflected in an amendment to the election timetable. On filling of vacancies, the only way as it currently stands to select a replacement commissioner should an elected commissioner vacate their post partway through their elected term is for Scottish ministers to appoint a replacement. The amending regulations allow for the filling of vacancies that arise amongst elected members by candidates who polled the next greatest number of votes behind the elected member. This process will be repeated until a person accepts the invitation or until the list of candidates is exhausted. If the list of candidates is exhausted, then the Scottish ministers would then be able to make an appointment. The amending regulations also allow Scottish ministers to leave a vacancy unfilled in the case of a vacancy arising less than a year before the election, providing the Crofting Commission remains quorate. On retention of documents, the amending regulations allow for the retention of certain documents for a period of 5 years. This is a consequential requirement of the new provision of filling vacancies. In order to operate, this requires certain information about the last election to remain available. On election expenses, the amending regulations increase the 211 limit from £600 to £700 and require all candidates to make a declaration of all payments made and present all relevant bills and receipts. On consequential amendments, etc., the amending regs include a number of minor amendments consequential to other changes. They revoke 2 provisions which were included in the Principal regulations in error. Regulation 11.2 of the Principal regulations is revoked to make clear that non-business days should not be discounted from the election timetable when referring to periods of weeks, making the election timetable clearer to the reader. Regulation 49 of the Principal regulations is also revoked, as this referred to information relevant to the single transferable vote system, whereas the Crofting Commission elections operate under the alternative vote system. I can confirm a public consultation and proposed changes to election arrangements took place, convener, from the 18th of March to the 22nd of June this year. The consultation paper responses and the analysis report have been published on the Scottish Government website. On impact assessments, I can confirm that an equality impact assessment has been completed and no equality impact issues were identified. Lastly, in terms of financial impact, no business and regulatory impact assessment has been prepared, as no impact upon business, public bodies or the third sector is foreseen. And in conclusion, I apologise for the length of the opening statement, but sought to cover a number of disparate aspects of the proposed regulations. Thank you for listening, and I would commend these amendment regulations and, of course, would be pleased to try and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to go to Stuart Stevenson first, if I may. He has a question.
Thank you. It's just a technical question, which I think it might be useful for future reference to get the answer on the record. In looking at the filling of vacancies among elected members, at section 10 in the order, which refers to 54A in the original order, at 4 there, it talks of the person who would replace would be qualified to be a candidate at an election under Regulation 9. Just for clarity, I'm assuming, but the order seems to be silent, that the qualification relates to the date on which the vacancy occurs, rather than them being qualified originally. And it would just perhaps be helpful to just confirm that, since presumably they would have been qualified at the original date in any event, otherwise they could not have stood. In other words, they have to remain qualified through to that point.
Yes, that's correct. If at the time of giving the invitation they remain qualified, yes.
So that is the relevant day plus?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Rhoda, I think you've got a question.
I guess I'm a bit concerned about replacing someone who was elected by the next person with the next amount of votes, the next highest amount of votes. I mean, we're all kind of aware that quite often you have maybe a couple of people standing, one will win by a country mile and the other person gets no support. I'd be kind of concerned if they were elected at that point, having no or little or no support, and especially when the Cabinet Secretary said that they will go through the list to probably the person eventually who has pulled the least number of votes. That's not very democratic if that person is there with no support.
Well, I suppose one could draw a comparison with the elections to this Parliament in the event of by-elections of a list MSP, but that's perhaps a mischievous reflection. So instead of giving that as an answer, I think I'll pass to Judith Brown, if I may, Convener.
Mischievous, I agree. Judith.
It's not the same. They're not on a list.
It was perhaps this is to look at the schedule to the Crofters Scotland Act 1993. Schedule 1, as introduced by the 2010 Act, paragraph 6 sets out the arrangements where an elected member ceases to hold office, and it provides that Scottish ministers may appoint a member where the member who has left is not replaced by a person such as is mentioned in subparagraph 4. Subparagraph 4 then goes on to say that the person who would normally fill the vacancy is the person who was a candidate in the election by virtue of which the elected member held office and who polled at that election fewer votes than the elected member, and who by virtue of regulations made under paragraph 7 of the schedule may hold office as a member of the Commission. So it was Parliament's intention at the time that those provisions were passed that the way in which vacancies should be filled amongst elected members was from people who had stood at election who had polled fewer votes rather than, for instance, from a by-election. So that is simply, these provisions are to give effect to that intention of Parliament.
I'm concerned about it, but as you say, that's in the legislation. I think we maybe need, that just adds to the long list of things that's maybe wrong with the legislation.
It's a very reasonable point that Rhoda Grant makes. I think it's one that we can all recognise, but I think the point that Judith Brown has very helpfully and clearly made is that the 1993 Act as amended indicates that the intended process for filling vacancies was not through by-elections, but through the process now included in these regulations. Now, if that is correct, and I have no reason to doubt the advice from our legal advisor, then I think it is really up to this Parliament now to implement the will as expressed in the law as passed by previous Parliaments. Of course, if in due course we come on to discuss the reform of the law, then as the member has just indicated that, and she raises a very, very fair point, I do not doubt that at all, then, to be serious, it is something that would be a very legitimate area for debate.
I have a question, Cabinet, or in fact two, if I may. First of all, Cabinet Secretary, are you aware if any of the changes to the election criteria for the commissioners will mean that any of the current commissioners are disbarred from standing again?
Well, I'm not so aware, and in any event, that's not something on which I think I would be likely to opine unless I were in possession of very, very clear evidence, because it would be quite a significant comment to make. But I am not so aware. I don't know if my officials have anything further to add.
No awareness, no.
I mean, I wonder if they could just add, and it's a question that did occur to me earlier, and one which I haven't had the opportunity to reflect in detail, but you know, we have heard from the opening statement a convener that the amending regulations add grounds, namely not misuse or neglect, cultivate and maintain the croft. I mean, and where the Commission has decided that such persons are failing to fulfil those duties, they would be disqualified. I mean, are officials aware whether there have been any persons that the Commission have decided fall into these categories or not?
I'm not aware of any current cases that are ongoing where the Commission has made a decision that a breach has occurred.
My second question is a general question in the sense that the Cabinet Secretary will understand that this committee has been looking at crofting issues and will be continuing to look at crofting issues during the course of this morning. And I just wondered if that as a result of that and as a result of the information gathering that the Cabinet Secretary is undertaking separate to the committee, and there is a decision to change completely crofting law, whether these elections will hinder his ability to do so. And I'd like some assurance that that wouldn't be the case if that was the decision and the decision of this Parliament.
I think I can offer that assurance. I mean, plainly, it is the duty of Parliament to consider any question of law reform, and we do so on the basis that we have a Crofting Commission which performs regulatory functions which require to be carried out under the existing system. So plainly, the Commission needs to continue to function and operate, and it's correct that we make proper provision for it so to do. And the the elections take place in March next year for 5-year elected appointments. That takes us through to 2022. We will go on to discuss the, at a sort of high initial early level, early stage, at a high level, issues relating to crofting reform. But I think it's fair to say that that process quite properly should not be rushed and will take quite a long time. And therefore, we do need, obviously, to have a functioning crofting commission, and therefore I think I can give the assurance that the decisions we make today will in no way impede or impair the rights and responsibilities of this Parliament and members of this Parliament.
Any other questions from the committee? I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary, therefore, and his officials for giving the evidence that they have to the committee. And I'd like to move on to agenda item 2, if I may. And the second agenda item is the formal consideration of motion S5M02263, calling for the committee to recommend approval of the draft Crofting Commission Election Scotland Amendments Regulations 2016. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak and to move motion S5M02263.
I commend these regulations to the committee.
Sorry. Could I ask you to commend to move the motion? Sorry, to
Moved.
Okay, thank you. Do any members have any further questions or comments? So the question is to the committee: is that motion S5M02263 in the name of Fergus Ewing be approved? Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay, we are agreed. That concludes consideration of this affirmative instrument, and we will report the outcome of our consideration to Parliament. I'll now briefly suspend the meeting to allow the witness panel to be reconfigured. The third item on our agenda item is our final evidence session regarding the review of legislative priorities for crofting. The Cabinet Secretary and Gordon Jackson are now joined by Michael O'Neill, the Scottish Government's crofting bill team leader. As I've mentioned in previous meetings, the committee is particularly conscious that there have been some contentious crofting issues in the media in recent weeks. However, the committee does not intend to stray into these specific areas, and I would urge committee members and indeed the witnesses to focus on the legislative priorities, please. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement?
Many thanks for the opportunity to discuss the matters relating to the future of crofting legislation. In recent months, I've met a number of stakeholders and in each case have been hugely impressed by the enthusiasm that they display and the sense that so much can be achieved if everyone is pulling in the same direction. I would like the process of modernising crofting law to bring people together, Convener, and for them to take the opportunity presented to work constructively for the future good of crofting. The Scottish Government is committed to crofting and committed to support for crofting, and that support is wide-ranging, including CAG's grants, CAP payments, SRDP, Pillar 2 grants, and LFAS and others. We've made commitments we intend to deliver during this Parliament. These are the introduction of a new entrance scheme for crofting, the development of a national development plan for crofting, to explore whether we can create new woodland crofts, the reintroduction of a croft house loan scheme, ensuring new community landowners are not left out of pocket due to registering as the new landlord of crofts within their community-owned estates, and reforming crofting law. If this committee and members have any ideas, then of course we are very grateful for them and keen indeed to hear them individually and collectively. Turning to crofting law reform, this is the topic of the day, and we understand that crofters have long been concerned at overly complicated and outdated legislation, so we want to modernise crofting law to make it more transparent, understandable and workable in practice. A lot has changed since crofting law came into force in 1886. Some argue it's very outdated and it's time for a clean slate approach to be taken, convener, to ensure that the law best serves crofting in the 21st century. Others argue that we should sort out all the problems, reconcile all the nuances and consolidate, but leave the basic components as they are. Others still think a hybrid approach should be taken. Now, I know much good work has already been done through both the Shucksmith report and in relation to the creation of the crofting law SUMP, so-called. It's important we use this work to inform that work and what we'll be undertaking in relation to developing new law. Whatever the approach, I think we need to think strategically about what we want from crofting and what we want and expect from new legislation. We need to be clear at the outset what we want crofting to deliver. So being clear about the role of crofting in Scotland and the vision that we have for it will, I think, be key. I want the new law that's developed to be fit for meeting crofting needs in the future. And in thinking about that future, we must consider many issues, such as the flexibility to cater for new entrants, or that crofts need not be thought of in any way as hobby farms, but thriving rural businesses as well as productive agricultural units. It's important we're clear why we need change, what change we want to see, and how we plan to achieve that, bearing in mind that creating new legislation might not be the only way to do this. It's essential that stakeholders engage and help the Scottish Government with the development of new legislation, and indeed I've been pleased to meet thus far many of the stakeholders, and there's more meetings that I will of course be keen to do with individuals who have a profound knowledge and experience of crofting, as well as organisations, representative bodies, statutory bodies and others. And all of this work is to ensure that we are in the best position to create the right environment in which crofters and communities can further contribute to successful rural Scotland. So, crofting legislation is important and we need to get it right. And it is an essential part of our history and our culture. So for me, to wind up, move towards a conclusion, it is, I think, crucial that we take the time to do this, to do it properly. I have my own views and policy objectives, but these are not set in stone. No doubt your questions this morning and the role of the committee will help us all to develop our thinking in this regard. But I want the process of creating new law to be an open one, and I'm keen, very keen, and determined that others out with this place engage so that their views are clear and can be considered in the work that is undertaken. We are here a long way from the crofting counties by geography and perhaps in many other ways too. So I know that from my own experience in government that the best solutions are arrived at collaboratively and after a great deal of thought and discussion. And it's in that spirit of cooperation, convener, that I would wish to take the future of crofting law forward. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, thank you for those opening remarks. I think a lot of what you said reflects the keenness that this committee has in taking crofting forward and making it fit for purpose and to serve the aspirations of those involved and also for those people within Scotland. And I think the first question on that is going to be on a direct statement that you made, and that's from Peter.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. My question is a very basic question. It gets right to the heart of the matter. And we've been taking the evidence from various witnesses, and we've had various ideas as to what crofting is all about. You know, is it about population retention? Is it about farming? Is it about housing? Is it about something else? So we believe that any legislation which covers crofting should be underpinned by a clear policy on what the Scottish Government expects crofting to deliver. So my question is, what does the Cabinet Secretary consider the purpose of crofting to be in the 21st century?
Well, I think crofting serves many purposes. I think to think of it as requiring only one purpose is not the way I would urge people to think about crofting. I think it serves and indeed fulfills many purposes, Convener, and perhaps that's a good starting point Mr. Chapman has raised in order to allow us to think of the various roles and purposes that it fulfills. For example, crofting undoubtedly contributes towards population retention. It also contributes towards the sustainability of rural and remote communities. Communities where, as members know, especially those representing the crofting counties areas in the Highlands, that there tend to be fewer opportunities than in cities, for example. Fewer opportunities to get jobs, fewer opportunities to set up businesses, perhaps a lesser likelihood of being connected to the internet. And connectivity, of course, is never far away from any debate, and rightly so these days. So population retention, sustainability of remote and rural communities, of course, at a very basic level, crofting activity for a great many thousands of people, Convener, provides a supplement to family income. I think it's perhaps reasonable to say that that income is unlikely to be the sole income in almost all cases, I would suggest. Perhaps not all, but most cases of crofting now where there is crofting in terms of agriculture activity carried out, the income may supplement work that is done as a main job or self-employment. I think I'm right in saying, for example, that when I met Stuart Robertson in the ARPID office in Stornoway that I visited when I was on holiday this year, I do tend to have lots of busman's holidays, that he was able to inform me that the largest payment in terms of finance to a crofter, of which he was aware under the basic scheme, was £22,000. Now, compared, I think many members may be aware in this room that, that would not be an enormous payment to many farmers. And I think I just make the point that there is a purpose, of course, to provide an income, but that very often will be a very modest income indeed, very modest income. But nonetheless, it is an income, and perhaps it provides that difference between a subsistence existence and perhaps just providing a little bit more comfort and opportunity. So it also contributes towards agriculture. It also contributes towards society and the cohesion of society. And therefore, I've mentioned some purposes, but I hope that members will see that crofting is not one thing. It's not about one thing. It doesn't have a sole purpose. And perhaps for that reason, as well as many others, it's very important that we continue to support it in the work that we do in this Parliament.
Fine.
Cabinet Secretary, thank you for the full answer. I mean, I'm going to warn you just slightly, if I may, that there are a huge amount of questions, and we don't want to miss any of the replies that you get. So I would ask you, and indeed members of the committee, to make sure their questions are as focused as possible. And on that basis, I'm going to go to the Deputy Convener, Gail, for the next question.
Thank you. Point taken. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you for your time this morning. As you know, the function to develop crofting currently sits with Highlands and Islands Enterprise. How effective do you think this is? And what's your opinion on maybe the development function sitting alongside the regulation function in the Crofting Commission?
Well, I think HIE is well placed to perform its development role, not least because, unlike Scottish Enterprise, as members know, it has a social function as well as an economic duty, and therefore it does differ in its statutory duties, but also I think in the way it approaches its task. And from the knowledge I have of individuals who work for HIE, I think there is an affinity for crofting, an understanding of crofting, and therefore an ability, I think, to be responsive in many cases. Of course, HIE tends to deal with perhaps the larger business enterprise. Business Gateway exists to deal with less so they both play a part. I think the Crofting Commission is effectively and substantially and primarily a regulatory body, and it does not have the budget to be a development body. And it's important to remember it's not just about which organisation has the duty, but also what is the budget to fulfil that duty. And therefore the two issues must be considered together. So I am aware from my own knowledge that HIE is working intensively with around 50 communities in its most fragile area, and I do support that. I'll just finish by saying that when the Crofting Reform Scotland Act was introduced in 2010, a conscious decision was taken to remove the development and grant-giving functions carried out by the Crofters Commission, the predecessor body, from the range of functions transferred to the Commission. And the Scottish Government, through ARPID, administers, for example, the Croft House Grant, the CAGS scheme, Support for New Entrants, Agri-Environment, Crofting Cattle Improvement Scheme, and indeed I have been able to involve myself in many of these decisions, which are taken, I think, fairly swiftly and reasonably efficiently as far as I can see, although if others take a different view about how well we perform those functions, I would be very keen to hear that. I think it's a perfectly legitimate area for debate, and I would welcome the committee's thoughts once it's explored this issue with all the witnesses, as well as, I hope, listening to what I've had to say on the matter.
Thank you.
Richard, I think you've got a follow-on.
Yes, Morning, Cabinet Secretary. HIE is the Scottish Government's economic and community development agency, supporting businesses, strengthening communities, basically has done a tremendous job in the last 30, 40 years. Young crofters are people who want to get into crofting, go to a bank and ask for a loan, and the bank says no, because they don't have title or whatever over the money, over the land. Do you believe, as I do, that HIE should get involved in small loans to people in order to encourage and develop crofting?
I think the question of access to affordable housing is a key issue, and part of that issue, I think, is access to secured loan finance to mortgages, to use the, so I still think of it as the English term, heritable securities, the Scots law term, but mortgages wins the day, I suspect. So I think there is perhaps an unfairness which arises through the vagaries of the crofting law. It's quite difficult to get a mortgage. You have to decroft, and even then it's difficult. And it's difficult for practical reasons, because many crofters have a seasonal income and therefore are not able to persuade a bank or a building society that they are a sufficient financial standing to qualify for a mortgage. And it's difficult also because many of the houses that are built are self-built, and it's traditionally difficult to secure a mortgage over that. But the actual vagaries of the crofting law make it extremely difficult to get mortgages. I think that's basically unfair. And the process of decrofting is one that doesn't exist for people out with the crofting counties. I mean, if those members here have bought a house, how would you feel about having to go to a regulatory body first to apply for permission to buy a house? If one thinks about it, it is a bit of an anomaly. And it's one that I have raised, convener, with for example, the Scottish crofting lawyers. And I know that at least one of them has opined on various ways that this could be resolved. And I think, in fact, it was in the last legislation at stage 3, but was removed at stage 3. I think this is undoubtedly one of the key areas that we all need to consider very carefully indeed, because I think as a matter of fundamental rights, it's unfair that people living in crofting land should find it so difficult to get access to a loan to build or buy a house on the same terms as everybody else not in the crofting counties. Lastly, I don't particularly think that HIE have the role of sorting this out. I think it's for Parliament to sort this out, working with, for example, the Association of Clearing Banks. And it's an issue, finally, convener, I'm sorry to go on about this, but I have done a bit of work in this matter already. I've met with most of the major banks in Scotland over the past wee while. I've asked them all to consider this. I've asked them all to contribute towards this issue and the resolution of this issue, and I believe that they are all willing so to do. And if we can tackle this, working with everybody, because it's a controversial issue, a loss of tenure, security of tenure is after all, that's what the Napier Commission 1886 Act was all about. So it's not without controversy, but I do hope that we can study it in detail and find options for solutions.
You've got to follow up, have you?
Yes, just going back to the role of High around crofting development rather than houses, but business development. I think a lot of the evidence we got was that they worked with crofting communities, but what was missing and what the Crofters Commission had provided in the past was actually individual business advice to individual crofters on how they could develop their business and, you know, increase their income. And that seems to have disappeared to a large extent. And I'm wondering if there's a way of getting either High to do that or the Crofting Commission to do that.
Well, I think that's a very interesting observation, and I would like to see the, look closely at the evidential basis for that proposition. And, you know, I think across Scotland, the advice can always be improved to business or potential businesses, New Start and so on. Plainly, the Business Gateway and not HIE will have, in most cases, that responsibility, just as it has in the rest of Scotland, where SE, Scottish Enterprise, deal with larger businesses. So I think the responsibility is primarily with Business Gateway, but then, of course, many crofters are in agricultural activity, and there are various sources of advice available to them. Mentoring, for example, available from the banks, very often provide free of charge. There's mentoring arranged through HIE, although that's for larger companies. But also, you know, we are providing finance to the SRUC, the Rural College, to Scotland's Rural College, to provide advice, and I would expect that to extend to crofters. I will check and make sure specifically that does so in response to this question in relation to Farm Advisory Service. So there's a whole range of areas potentially where advice needs to be sought. But I think I would certainly agree with the proposition that we need to be sure that appropriate advice is available to those who live and work in the crofting counties and who wish it. And I think it's especially important that businesses should be nurtured, should be supported where possible and appropriate, and that the relevant sources of advice and mentoring should be available to them. So again, I think, you know, this is an important area that the committee has raised.
Cabinet Secretary, a question that an issue that's been raised is about forming new crofts and giving new entrants the opportunity to do that, which forms under the development principles that HIE could do. And one of the suggestions that we heard was that there should be some resumptions, especially on crofting estates which have been purchased by the community. There should be resumptions of some areas of common grazings to allow the formation of new crofts. Do you have a view on whether that would encourage more crofters and make more communities more vibrant, or do you think that's a bad idea?
Well, we are committed to introducing a new entrance scheme for crofting, so we certainly welcome suggestions about how that can operate, and the work has already begun within the Crofting Stakeholder Forum, as I think you're aware, Convener, to identify what a scheme might look like, and we understand that a draft new entrance paper has been compiled, and that focuses strongly on making crofts available and reintroducing the croft entrance scheme. As with all papers, the new entrance paper, once finalised, will be presented to Parliament in some shape or form. And in the meantime, of course, crofters are eligible to apply for other new entrance schemes already, and funding is available through CAP, such as the Young Farmer Startup Grant, the New Entrance Startup Grant, and New Entrance Capital Grant Scheme. So, you know, I do think the proposal that you make is one that has certain controversy, but should be the subject of consideration, and it will be something that we will look at carefully, working with the committee in the new entrance scheme.
Okay, John, do you want to go next?
Okay, thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to ask Cabinet Secretary about the programme for government, which commits to beginning work on the National Development Plan for crofting this year. Now, we've heard various opinions on that, including from Sir Crispin Agnew, that might be challenging within the existing limitations of the Act, and other comments about no active crofting policy to develop new entrants and other issues you've touched on there from David Finlay. Are you able to advise, please, on the timescale for the production of the National Development Plan?
Yes, a very fair question. The plan for Scotland, Scotland's programme for government, which was published a couple of months ago, makes clear that we will engage with crofting stakeholders to start the process of drafting a new national development plan for crofting as part of a sustainable rural economy. And this will focus on what we want from crofting in the future rather than what has gone on in the past, although it goes without saying that pieces of work such as the Shuck-Smith report and the Crofting Law Sump will indeed set a helpful context. So we must use the benefits and the fruits of all the work, the valuable work that's been done by a great many people in the past. There will be further stakeholder engagement, and that process has, of course, already commenced. The development plan will, of course, include a wide variety of measures to support new entrants, support for crofting housing, exploration of potential to create woodland crofts, and ensuring that community-owned estates are not disadvantaged by the croft registration process. All of these things will be the topic of the plan, and we have therefore begun the process of delivery of that. I mean, as with all these things, Convener, I think the process should be governed by the principle of getting it right, not getting it out. We need to get this right. That is the priority. And I think we are all, and this committee work will be a useful contribution to that process. But it's far more important to have a plan that is right, that wins support, that commands buy-in and is deliverable and visionary but practical. It's far more important that we do that than rush something out, which would be very, very easy to do, but not the right approach.
Can you clarify, Cabinet Secretary? Thank you for that reply. Who would be responsible for the implementation of the plan, please?
The buck stops with me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Cabinet Secretary, can I just ask on that? I understand that your determination to get it right, and I think that's entirely the right approach, if I may say so. But you will have a timescale in your brain of when you are looking to get it right by. Could you give us an indication on the committee when that is? Because you haven't done that yet, and I just wondered if I could push you for some guidance on that, please.
Well, obviously, we're talking about the National Development Plan, I think, not the bill at the moment. But we haven't set, and in our manifesto, which this is one of the pledges that we contained in it, advisedly, obviously, we didn't set timescales in these because I guess the authors of the manifesto knew that it is a matter that needs to be the subject of careful thought. So I haven't set, and I don't have in my brain a definite timescale, but I'm always keen to make swift progress, as swift as is possible. To answer your question directly, I would envisage that it will be possible within a reasonable period of time to set some kind of a target as to timing, because people want us to make progress. But I'm not planning to do so today because I just think it's too early. We haven't really yet had the chance to hear views from crofters, from the representatives, about precisely what they want to see in the plan. I've mentioned a series of things, but it could well be that the process of engagement may raise a whole other series of things, and many of them occur to me about more focus perhaps on potential areas of further diversification. Food and drink, tourism, renewable energy are all areas which are very, very important for many individual crofters. So there may be a whole host of ideas, and I don't want to delimit and constrain the ability of the National Development Plan to be ambitious, bold and effective by the arbitrary setting prematurely of a timetable. But you know, I do want to make progress always swiftly. So I may give you a clearer answer at some point in the reasonably near future, if that's any consolation.
Reasonable, relative, near. I'm not sure I'm any clearer at the end of that, but I think perhaps we'll leave it at that stage at the moment. Stuart, unless anyone else has got a question on the development plan Stuart, I think you've got the next question.
Thank you. I have a series of questions about the Crofting Commission itself. The first of which relates to the review of the Crofting Commission, and I just wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could tell us a little bit more about the objectives of that and any indications of the timetable and how the government might deal with the outcomes from it.
Yes, I think I can. The review will consider the Crofting Commission board governance arrangements, the systems, procedures and support mechanisms that are in place to underpin effective decision-making. It will give due regard to the 3 recent common grazings cases at Bohunton, Upper Call and Mangersta, although not the decisions taken. The review will also examine arrangements that are in place to handle conflicts of interest. The work will be undertaken by business advisors and accountancy firm Scotman Creef. We expect to make the report of findings available early next year. The review will help to promote effective governance within the Commission, and it's an opportunity, I think, to take stock and learn from experiences and examine positives as well as opportunities for improvement. We would expect the report with its findings to serve to inform the new board of the Crofting Commission convener following the elections in spring next year, and the Scottish Government will work with the Commission through its normal sponsorship arrangements to ensure that due regard is given to the review outcomes.
I'm going to change the order of the next 2 questions in the light of what's just been said, but I will deal with them both. One of the issues that has arisen in evidence is related to delegated decision-making and perhaps delegating directly to commissioners. And you highlighted that one of the things that the review of the Commission was looking at was things like conflict of interest. And perhaps that gives a context to the question. Do you think that the current processes of delegated decision-making are actually working to the interests of both the Commission and the crofting areas?
Well, we are supportive of excuse me, the Crofting Commission's delegated decision-making initiative. And my officials inform me that this has been undertaken in parallel with the Crofting Commission Board initiative to develop and implement regulatory policies that set the framework within which delegated decisions can be taken. And this is good for governance, and the initiative improves organisational efficiency and effectiveness and frees up commissioners' time to work on more strategic matters. That, I think, can only be a good thing. And delegated decision-making is sensible, I think, for many bodies and can work extremely well where the delegation is supervised and is carried out effectively. For example, in local planning authorities, it's, I think, routinely and correctly used in order to free up the time of senior officials and indeed members to look at the cases that really warrant sufficient time and expense to be devoted. So I think in general I support delegated decision making, and I'm told that it's working reasonably well.
Well, in relation to the elected members, and of course there are also appointed members, there appears to be a tension from the evidence that we've had between the idea that elected members have to act on behalf of the whole Commission, or that they are simply there as delegates from their own constituencies. Now that's something that we're probably familiar with here as well. And I just wonder whether the system of elected commissioners in dealing with that tension between these two perhaps alternative duties that there are on commissioners is working well. And perhaps related to that, how well do those who are appointed help those who are elected to take a corporate view rather than an individual one, which I'm sure will be necessary from time to time.
Well, these are matters of debate, and indeed I discussed this very issue with my officials earlier this morning. Elected commissioners have the responsibility and are expected to bring their knowledge of crofting from their respective constituency areas and to use that knowledge better to inform board decisions on regulatory matters. The Crofting Commission, as I've mentioned earlier, is fundamentally a regulatory body, And if one thinks of that, then that puts into sharp relief the potential conflict of interest of an elected commissioner, for example, in representing one individual person in one individual case. And I think there is a fundamental debate here about the role of the elected commissioners, because each of us here would probably take the view, and I certainly do, that the job that we have is to represent all constituents, individuals, and to do so irrespective of their views, our views, their politics, our politics, their position, their standing, to represent everyone. And therefore, it would be, I think, a matter of common view that someone who is elected should represent those who elected him or her. But in a regulatory body, such as the Commission, the purpose is to effect and carry out and implement regulations. So this is an area, I think, a very important area for debate and perhaps a potentially reform of the law in due course. And I'd be very interested to hear the committee's views after it's had a chance to reflect on what I've said, but also what has been said by others and evidence in this regard. It's not an easy task, I think, an elected commissioner.
So to take that back to where I started, this is essentially part of the review of the Crofting Commission, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it should be something that the committee considers, well, if it wishes to, in the sense that it is a legitimate and important area of debate. You know, what is the duty of an elected commissioner of the Crofting Commission? Is it to individuals, or is it to the area? And is it to bring knowledge and expertise to the board, or is it to opine, lobby, put forward the case of individuals? I'm not prescribing any of these views, but it does appear to me, having had some thought about this, that there are potential areas of reform in relation to the proposed legislation.
Okay. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. John, I think you're up with the next question.
Thanks, Convener. As the Cabinet Secretary probably knows, my constituency does not cover many crofts, so I am learning as we go along. So my questions are on the kind of area of costs and administration, and to start with having to register a croft. Now, the point has been made to us that there are quite considerable costs involved in registering a croft. In particular, there are, I think, always adverts in newspapers, which I think some people question as being maybe a little bit out of date and can be quite expensive. There seem to be often legal costs and other costs in the whole registration process. And we had some witnesses certainly suggesting that that's an area that there could be a bit of modernisation and perhaps simplification on. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it's another good point that's been raised, Convener, by your committee members today, and there are costs involved. The costs are incurred in maintaining the register, which is free to search online. The fee for registering or updating a croft is £90, and this fee is based on the common principle of public finance, namely cost recovery. It remains the same since the register commenced on 30th November 2012, and Scottish ministers recently announced that the fees charged by Registers of Scotland will remain the same. In terms of potential cost savings, the 210 Act provides that in most cases the applicant for first registration of a croft must, on receipt of the certificate, give public notice of registration by placing an advertisement for 2 consecutive weeks in a local newspaper circulating in the area where the croft is situated, and this requirement has been the subject to much criticism as the cost of advertising, as Mr Mason quite rightly raised, is not inconsiderable. As part of the regulatory review process, we will explore options for removing or reducing costs in this area, possibly through use of some form of web-based notification system. This does need to be considered carefully, but I think the member has raised a very valid point indeed, and one to which I have a degree of sympathy.
That's great, thank you. Secondly, there's the whole question of mapping common grazings. Now, I'm not entirely clear, but it was suggested to us that in the past there was specific funding or budget given to the Crofting Commission to carry out mapping of common grazings, and that is no longer the case, and that appears to be their reason for not carrying out mappings of common grazings at the present time. I wonder if you can confirm if that is also your understanding, or if you were expecting the Crofting Commission to be carrying on this kind of work within their existing budget?
Well, I think I should say that there's been no funding withdrawn. The Scottish Government provided the Commission with an additional £400,000 over the 4-year period from 2012-13 and 2015-16. At the outset, this was expected to be sufficient to facilitate registration of all the common grazings. That's circa 1,000 common grazings. The task proved more challenging than first anticipated, and despite the Crofting Commission adding significant levels of resource from its own budget, it was only able to register around 300 common grazings, Convener. That equates to around £1,300 per grazing, without taking into account resources above the £400,000 budget that were invested by the Crofting Commission. So it's likely the registering grazings committees without a committee in office, around 500, will be more resource intensive. Any decision on whether to devote resources from within its existing budget allocation to continue with common grazings registration would be for the Crofting Commission to make, and would need to be balanced against the other responsibilities of the organisation, such as processing regulatory applications, tackling absenteeism, and administering the annual Crofting census. And I think it does illustrate, I think, the importance of the governance review that we are carrying out, and I think also the importance of ensuring that there is delegated work carried out in some cases to allow the body to operate as efficiently as possible. So I think, again, it's a very important area. It's been identified, and I hope I've given the full factual detail of the situation at the moment, if not a sort of perfect solution to the problem. But it's one that we are looking at and is important.
Okay, and you said there's a governance review, and of course that could throw up a lot of different things, I imagine. Yes. But you have no plans then, if there was 400,000 specifically over 4 years in the past, there's no plan to repeat that then? Another 400,000 to move it on?
Well, it's the way in which to continue the work, I think, should be considered by the new Crofting Commission following the elections next year. A perfect legitimate topic for the process of elections, of course. And it's one that we will need to discuss with the Crofting Commission as to how we achieve a task that we all wish to be carried out effectively and swiftly. Of course, the registration process is not alone. It's not only the Crofting counties where there's much work to be done in completing registers. The land register, of course, as members will know, is being converted to map-based land certificates as paired to the Register of Seizing. So, these things, I think most people would see, are matters that are progressed but cannot be done overnight. It's in the nature of the beast that this work must be done with great care and meticulous attention to detail, otherwise it is of no purpose.
I think we've heard as a committee the importance of making sure that the system is map-based, and the point that John raised and you've answered on has been reflected in the answers that we've had from previous witnesses. But there's definitely a call from all the witnesses that we've had, I think, across all the bodies, that they need more money to do the registration of crofts. And I guess with the budget coming up, I would wonder if you, Cabinet Secretary, have made a plea for some extra money to allow the registration to be carried forward over the next couple of years to get it right.
Well, I think, as members will be aware, there's huge pressures on the budget from many sources. What I undertake is that I will communicate with the Commission in order to explore how best we ensure that we all fulfil the functions which rest upon us.
John, you want to follow up as well?
Yes, my final point, really on this area of administration and so on in the register, is that I understand that to appeal against something in the register, one has to go to the land court. Now, it has been suggested, we've had slightly different evidence, I think, from witnesses, because it's been suggested that a mediation service might be helpful, and that would save having to go to court and resolving disputes in that way, which presumably can be expensive. On the other hand, we were told by one witness that actually the land court's quite a friendly court. You don't have to have a lawyer, and so it's not such a bad process. So I just wonder if you feel there's a need for mediation or if you feel the land court process is sufficient.
I'm just amused at the phrase friendly court, but listen, let me pass to Michael O'Neill for an answer on this one, if I may.
I think in looking at the changes in crofting law going forward, I think it's something that should be pursued in those considerations, because mediation may be a useful tool in settling disagreements. So far there have been, I think, around 44 challenges of croft registration and common registration, common grazing registration combined out of about 3,500 registrations. And it's my understanding, certainly, that most of these cases are considered by the Scottish Land Court, and that's done swiftly. And the process isn't intended to require any specialist legal representation, so that should hopefully reduce costs to crofters. There may still be people who are hesitant to take a challenge to court, but in fact that may be we're suggesting the current system is functioning well, and the vast majority of cases over boundary disagreements are resolved prior to registration. So I think if mediation were to be progressed, we'd need to consider the financial implications with that and the risks that there would still be challenges that would likely end up in the Land Court.
So in fact, you're almost saying there could actually be extra costs if we brought in an extra layer?
There's potentially, yes.
Right. I'm with you. Thank you.
Mr. Jackson had a supplementary point. If that's...
Just to add to the context here that there has been 44 challenges as far as we know so far. That amounts to 1% of the cases, so it's relatively small, which suggests that in most cases amicable agreements are being reached.
Well, I suppose my only comment on that would be that the point that's already been made by Mr. O'Neill, that as soon as you mention the word court, some people back off, whether they feel they're right or they're wrong. But I accept none of us know that at the moment.
Okay. Mary, I think you've got a...
Oh, yes, thank you, Convener. I think one of the questions I was going to ask you actually touched on in your answer earlier, really, and it was really about access to mortgages for crofts. But the other question that I have relates to absenteeism and neglect. Obviously, we've heard from quite a few witnesses already, and it was just really to get your thoughts on the provisions in crofting law that deal with absenteeism and neglect. One of the witnesses that we had described it as the underlying principle is simple, but the process is anything but. And it would just be really to hear your thoughts on that around those provisions.
Yes, I would say the characterisation that you've given is one that might be shared by many people. I mean, I think we all accept that the underlying principle is simple, but the process is anything but. And in terms of absenteeism and neglect, the current legislation does have the means to deal with these issues, although some regard the process for dealing with any breach of a crofter's duty on an ad hoc basis as being cumbersome and long, and does not necessarily improve the overall situation in an individual community. I believe the Commission is trying to move how it focuses on issues of this nature to the idea of geographically based regulatory work where they operate within a particular community at the community's request to address issues concerned, including breach of duties. And regards new legislation, clearly the absenteeism issue and neglect issue will need to be considered, and the most appropriate way to deal with them thought through. So these are very sensitive issues indeed, Convener. They're about people's lives. And very often, you know, those who absentees from a croft have a very strong affinity for the croft. And indeed, they have to leave places like the Western Isles to go to Glasgow to work in the police force or the NHS. And all of us will probably know a great many people who have a real affinity for their croft. And I'm very, very conscious of that. And therefore, the need to deal with these matters very sensitively, I hope, is one that would be seen by all of us as appropriate.
Absolutely, and that's what I would say. I mean, some of the evidence that we'd heard, we'd had the young crofters in talking about, well, how important it is to get young people and to get new entrants into crofting as well. So I think the points that you touched on earlier in terms of mortgages were important, and I was glad to hear about the conversations that you'd had with the banks, because I think that is the big stumbling block, and I think it would be useful for us to, I don't know if it's possible for us to pursue more information on that as well, and to look further into that, because I think that they'll play an integral role in you know, in that situation.
The committee felt it appropriate to involve the banks. I think that would be a very welcome intervention if that was seen as appropriate by the committee.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, Cabinet Secretary, one of the issues that was mentioned was the Common Grazings Committees having to do reports, annual reports on crofting, and submit them back to cover things like absenteeism and neglect. And some of the Common Grazing Committees, I think, find that a particularly difficult area to deal with. And indeed, I'm not aware that the majority of Common Grazings Committee actually submit a report. Do you think there's a better way of dealing with that in relation to this incident?
Could I maybe ask Mr Jackson to deal with this?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. The 2010 Act required Common Grazings Committees to report at the earliest opportunity, but thereafter every 5 years and not every year. But it is a challenging area, obviously, because the committees might perceive that they're interfering with day-to-day crofters' business within the crofting communities. But nevertheless, it is a primary legislative requirement for them to do so.
Can I ask you, Mr Jackson, how many have actually submitted annual reports?
The Crofting Commission has recently encouraged Common Grazings Committees to come forward. They haven't done so as yet. I understand the Crofting Commission is asking people to come forward. Do you have a figure of the amount that have actually submitted reports? And if not, would it be possible for you to submit that to the committee in writing post this session? As far as I'm aware, no committees have yet reported.
So no committees have reported, despite the fact that it was instigated in the 2010 Act?
That's correct, yes.
So that may be something, do you feel that the committee should be looking at more closely in relation to the future of crofting?
I would certainly agree with that, yes.
Thank you. The next question is Richard.
Thank you, Convener. I entirely support crofting. It's part of the integral part of the Highlands and of Scotland. 1883, 133 years this Act has been on, been amended 22 times. Prior to that was the laird and then it was the crofter. But in 2010 we changed it to owner-occupiers. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with witnesses that the provisions of the 2010 Act on owner-occupiers are complex, inconsistent, have proven difficult to apply, and do you intend to consider future legislative changes to that?
Well, I'm no legal expert, but I was fortunate to have a very interesting, lengthy discussion with the Crofting Lawyers Group, and indeed many of their members are extremely experienced and well-informed. And I do think that the issue of the crofting law on owner-occupiers or crofting are extremely complex. It's been raised in the Crofting Law Sump by members of the Crofting Law Group, and there have been calls for a simpler definition of a crofter. I think it's important that new legislation does address this, and I'm open to suggestions on the issue as part of the considerations for new legislation. I do think one should go back to the discussion we had earlier, Convener, about what are we trying to achieve. And I think there is a case for consideration that what we should be trying to achieve is remove impediments for people obtaining affordable housing or any housing, access to a mortgage. These are issues that I think we would all, I hope, want to see progress made on, given the complexities which make some of these obvious, clear, simple, desirable social aims easier to achieve in the crofting counties as they are in other parts of Scotland. I think that the purpose should be the driver in the work that we do in relation to legal definitions. But it certainly, I think, requires to be simplified. So I would support, I think, the thrust of what Mr. Lyle says. But we should always remember that the 1886 Act came from the struggle of crofters in places like the Bernera riots and the Battle of the Braes 1874 and about 10 years thereafter. And it was only, if I may say so, Convener, the activism against the landlords of the time that brought that security of tenure following the Napier Commission. And these are not matters of history. These are strongly felt in the crofting counties as still today. So we need to proceed, I think, with clear objectives, but to do so with one eye on the history.
Can I totally agree with you, the last points you've made? And I'm a lowlander and I'm starting to learn about crofting and getting very interested in it. Right, the evidence to the committee so far has shown that owner-occupiers are in two camps. One who occupies a croft should be considered a crofter and be subject to the same rights and responsibilities. And then we have other owner-occupiers who should not be considered crofters and should not be subject to crofting regulations. Do you have a view on any of these opinions?
Well, I'm aware that there are two views, and this is, I think, again, a matter for legitimate debate and necessary. I think it would be impossible to approach the task that we have of crofting law without looking at these issues at a high level. But perhaps I could ask Mr. O'Neill to answer the question from more of a technical point of view.
I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it's one that will attract quite differing views amongst stakeholders and has the potential to potentially polarise opinions. And I think at the moment, given where we are in terms of thinking about new legislation, it's really too early to say there's a firm view on this. And there is a case to be made either way. And I think people should feel free to make their views heard as we go forward. So each case can be sort of considered on its merits.
Nina.
Richard, are you happy? Thank you. John, I think yours is the next question.
Thanks, Convener. Common grazing has been mentioned before. The whole question of grazing committees, there's been some suggestion. Some people seem to feel they're working, they're quite happy with them. Other people feel that they really need to be upgraded because a lot more things are being done, I think, with common ground than maybe used to be the case. I was interested looking back at the Shucksmith report where it says at community level, grazing committees should be modernised to become crofting township development committees with a broader remit and more inclusive membership. And the suggestion's been that now with wind turbines perhaps appearing or could appear on common grazing and perhaps other ways of using the land, that there needs to be kind of updating of grazing committees. I wonder if you have a view on that.
Well, yes, I do think that there is a very strong case for updating the role of grazing committees, and this was a topic that was raised with the crofting lawyers, and particularly I think by Sir Crispin Agnew, who may well have shared his thoughts with you on this. But I think the point is that grazing committees were very much a creature of their time and prescribed as an appropriate method of ensuring that the common elements of crofting were properly organised in a world where crofting was the norm, was the fundamental way of life and existence. As Mr. Mason has pointed out, things have changed substantially since then, but the role definition of crofting, of grazing committees and duties and functions and organisation hasn't been updated with it. So I think law reform should involve examination of the potential for grazing committees or their future equivalents to take on business development or community development company type roles. At present, they have the remit prescribed in statute as set out in sections 48 to 50B of the 93 Act, I'm told. And I think there may be a desire for Grazing Committee to assume a wider role, and this would be need to looked at in the context of legislation. But I just finish by saying that I'm keen to stress for those that are reading this official report that the vast majority of Grazing Committees function well and are staffed, are operated by people who give their time freely and voluntarily, pro bono, and we recognise and we value that work.
Okay, thank you. And then continuing in the theme of common grazing, the issue's been raised with us about a deemed croft in common grazing. And as I understand it, sometimes that may just be marked by an X on the map of the common grazing. And the whole question's been raised as to whether there's a conflict here, perhaps between guidance and between what is eligible in an IACS form. I think that's probably quite a complex area, but I'm not sure
Last, Mr. Jackson.
If we can...
It is a complex area, but the top-line answer is relatively simple. And the Scottish Government can see nothing to prevent Common Grazings Committees applying for funding under SRDP. And furthermore, it can see nothing with, through the IACS rules themselves, nothing in that suggests that land subject to common grazing rights is in itself precluded under IACS. So that is the position that's taken by Scottish Government in the matter.
So there's not really any change needed as far as you're concerned?
No.
No. Okay, thank you.
Can I follow up on that, please, Cabinet Secretary? And I don't know if who's the appropriate person to answer. I'm sure you'll decide. But one of the questions that we've had is that common grazings and shares in the common grazings can be separated from the croft to the extent that people, when they sell their croft, retain their common grazings shares and don't actually use them. Some people have suggested that that actually prevents new entrants getting a share in the common grazings, and it also means, as has been suggested by some witnesses, that those people with shares in the common grazings but aren't active crofters are able to benefit from any income that the common grazing achieves. Could you give the committee a view whether you think that is a problem, and if so, what you think should happen about it?
I think I've passed to Mr. Jackson on this, who I know has looked at this particular issue.
We don't actually have figures available, but anecdotal evidence does suggest that common grazings in a number of cases are underutilised, that people who do have shares aren't utilising them, and there's a missed opportunity. I think that this is an area that's already has been recognised by the committee. That needs to be looked at within the context of crofting law reform and how things are actually progressing in that particular area, because it is a missed opportunity. It's an opportunity in particular for new entrants, and it's something that's very important.
So, just so I understand that, Mr. Jackson, you're suggesting that you accept entirely that it's a problem, and there may be, as a farmer, I would say that we have rightly got rid of the slipper farming cases, but there may be slipper crofters in some. Well, we have got rid of a lot of them. I see the Cabinet Secretary shaking his head, but we have a situation where a shareholder in the common grazings may be taking income which he or she is entitled to from the common grazings, but doing no activity. Is that correct?
Not to my knowledge. The concept of active farmer still applies, and it's an area-based payment depending on active use. But I understand that there's an opportunity for those shareholders who don't actually utilise the common grazings to enter into an agreement where the share, the summing, is passed over to somebody else who can actually use it.
I'm just going to push you, if I may, just a wee bit on that, on the fact that you've said that there is no reason why a Commons Grazings Committee cannot claim for a payment, and indeed the Common Grazings Committee will get payments for resumptions and any use on the common grazings for wind farms. On the basis we've been told that they're not allowed to hold money, and that money belongs to the shareholders of the common grazings, and they have to pay out that money if it is not being used to improve the common grazings. They could actually be taking an income from the common grazings but not contributing to it. Is that correct, Mr. Jackson?
My understanding of the legislative provisions is, in case of resumption, resumption monies actually go via the constable and should be distributed timelessly to shareholders. It shouldn't actually, in actual fact, go to common grazings committees. And payments, furthermore, payments for use of the common grazings, Pillar 1 payments under the cap, should actually go to the shareholders and not to the Common Grazing Committee itself. So
a shareholder with shares in the common grazings but no croft could be capable of taking that money that's been paid under a grant scheme?
It's slightly complex in that particular scenario you describe. It's termed to be a deemed croft. Yes. So it's a croft for all intents and purposes, and if the shareholder is utilising the common grazing, then there would be entitlement to cap payments, yes.
But sorry, I'm just going to make an observation, if I may, but it's unlikely if he's got a deemed croft in the common grazing, that if he doesn't have in-by land, that he would necessarily be using the common grazings because there'd be nowhere to overwinter the stock. Yeah. But I'm going to push on with Peter, I think, on the question.
Another issue about the common grazings. We've heard that there's a real pressure for young new entrants to get into crofting, and it's very difficult for them to get a start for various reasons. But one of the suggestions was that there are thousands of acres of common grazings underutilised. Why can't we just, you know, take some of that land and create new crofts for new young keen folk to get into the crofting system?
Well, that's, I think this may have been touched upon earlier, and it's a perfectly legitimate point. I think it is one that should be considered very carefully indeed, because I think we all share the objective of wishing new entrants. You know, there's land of all sorts. I mean, I was, I think, questioned by John Scott in the Chamber last week about the general question of new entrants, and referred to work that is being done under the chairmanship of myself and Henry Graham in persuading public bodies who own land to look at land that they have. And of course, public bodies that own land in the crofting committees, counties, areas would be encouraged to look at new entrants, not simply only in farming, but also in crofting. So that's important work that is being done, with the potential, I think, to provide some opportunities for new entrants. The Forestry Commission, of course, has led the way in this, convener, but other public bodies like Scottish Water, Scottish Natural Heritage, SEPA, local authorities, and even smaller public bodies are actually quite large owners of land in Scotland. They hold it for the nation. They have all been asked and tasked by me and Mr. Graham to go away and come back fairly early in the new year to advise us whether they think there is potential to provide some of the land that they own, perhaps relatively small parts of it, Mr. Chapman, for new entrants. So that's a related piece of work that I hope will be of relevance to this topic.
I mean, that's one issue, but I mean, my specific question was regarding the common grazings. I mean, I understand what you say about the various other bodies, but is it possible to you know, use some of these common grazings to create new crofts as well?
Well, I think it's a perfectly legitimate point that should be considered further to explore the means of fulfilling an objective that we all share.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. John, I think you're next.
We've heard fairly frequent mentions of smallholders. I wonder if there's any plans the Scottish Government have to bring smallholders and crofters together, and indeed pose the question, could this be part of a simplification of crofting law?
Well, I'm not ruling out that there may be a need to simplify and improve the legislation governing small land holding, and the need to best make crofting and small land holding legislation work in practice. Unlike crofting, which is undertaken in specific parts of Scotland and only designated parts of Scotland, small land holdings are spread across the country. So turning them into crofts is not necessarily the answer. There's concentrations of small landholders in Ayrshire, Aberdeenshire, Dumfries, Scottish Borders and East Central Scotland. There are only a small number within the designated crofting areas. And recently I can share with the committee that my officials met small landholders on Arran, and they heard differing views. Some wanted to be crofters, some didn't. Some also don't want to be tenant farmers either. So it's right that we consider all of their views and the views of other small landholders across the country to give them an opportunity to have their voices heard before decisions are made that affect their homes and businesses.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rhoda, I think you're...
Yes. Obviously, the Scottish Government have said that they're going to legislate on crofting possibly towards the end of this Parliament. And you yourself have rehearsed some of the options for that legislation and how it will. You haven't expressed a preference. Is there one way of legislating coming forward that might be the preference of the Scottish Government, and what would be the time scale for consulting on that?
Well, there's a script here, but I think I don't need it because, so I won't use it. But I mean, I think there really are a kind of two main approaches and then a hybrid. The two main approach is a sort of clean sheet approach that's been advocated by some, and the second approach is to tidy it up, to use the good work that's been done by lawyers and others who have produced the SUMP, which is a slightly derogatory word since it refers to a container for wastewater, but it is actually a valuable container of useful ideas to reform and upgrade the legislation. But there are these two approaches: a fundamental overhaul, starting from first principles, to update crofting law fit for the 21st century. I hope I'm fair in saying that Sir Crispin Agnew has perhaps advocated that kind of thing, and to kind of overhaul definitions of grazing committees to bring them into a kind of modern parlance and concepts to allow them to be used as sort of community development vehicles, for example. So that's one approach, and the other approach is to tidy up the existing legislation. And others, a third group, perhaps argue for a hybrid approach. And there are others, and I should say this in completeness, that believe you can have crofting, but you can have crofting, but not necessarily with the Crofting Commission. That's not a view that I share, but it's a view that has been expressed by others in the debate. I have no set view on what approach should be taken, and indeed I think it's right that I shouldn't have a set view at this very early stage in consideration. And indeed, if it is the case that an overhaul is something that we should look at, then almost by definition, one should not have a set view until that approach has been fully considered. One should consider the merits of that approach first, before coming to a view as to the correct approach to take. All of that does mean, as I think Rhoda Grant says, that I do not anticipate the legislation will be in the first half of this parliamentary session, nor should it. And I think that most crofters of my acquaintance are blessed with large quantities of patience, and would far rather that we spend a lot of time and have a lot of discussion rather than kind of rush into one approach or another. That's the. I hope I've given a reasonably clear answer to Rhoda Grant.
When are you looking to consult on this, formally consult, so that you take some of those views forward? I suppose my own concern is that the 2010 Act, which has provided an awful lot of the issues that are now being put in the sump, because was done at the end of a parliament, and I would say with some undue haste because of the timing of that, that there wasn't the chance maybe to go back and review some of the provisions where concerns were being raised. If the new Crofting Act, whatever the form it takes, is at the same place in a parliament, then I suppose my own fear, and that's a personal fear, is that the same thing would happen, and we'd end up with legislation that then creates problems going forward. I agree we need to get it right, but rushing it through at the end of the parliament might not be the way of doing that.
Well, I hope it's not impertinent to say that I think it's a slightly kind of gloomy perspective to argue that legislation passed in the last year of a parliament is necessarily inferior to that passed at a different stage in parliament. And as someone who's been the lead minister in many pieces of legislation, some of which at the end of the parliament, I suppose it would be a concept with which I could only bristle, initially at least. But I think the important thing to me, to be serious, convener, is that I don't think this is a process to be rushed. I do sincerely think, and I'm not trying to dodge any question or dodge any question about timetable, I really do believe very strongly that we should tack tent, we should take time to listen to views very carefully. I don't think there's any compulsion or sort of compulsator that we've got to rush into this. I don't think that's, my impression is that's not what is expected of us. So I think that the fact that the committee has decided to do this work is a very welcome contribution to opening a debate on a topic where there are very clearly different approaches that could be taken. And therefore, we need to, I think, collectively consider that decision first very, very carefully about what we want to achieve by the work that we do in this place.
Yeah, if I could just really press you on this, Cabinet Secretary, because you said we should take time, but I mean, could we not, or could you not, or could somebody not fairly quickly make a decision as to whether we're just going to do a kind of sump tidying up exercise and maybe a consolidation, which would be pretty straightforward and we could move forward fairly quickly on, or the kind of clean sheet which clearly will take a lot longer if we're going to rewrite the whole legislation from scratch. So does that basic decision not need to be made fairly soon? Because there's no point delaying if we're just going to do the sump thing in 2 years' time.
No, I don't. I really accept that that's the correct way to look at it for the following reasons. First of all, if we decided simply to proceed with the sump, there will. I do not expect that that would be a simple process, and moreover, it would be one which would lend itself perfectly legitimately for every member who wished to supplement any bill with the first approach. If a bill is produced about crofting law, it's quite open to members to bring forward amendments to that bill to fundamentally overhaul crofting. So just by the government choosing one or other does not necessarily mean that that will be Parliament's choice. It is up to Parliament what choice to take. I would far rather work towards developing in collaboration an agreement about which approach to take between fundamental overhaul and upgrading and improving. And I think that does need time. And we've made it quite clear that we are not expecting to legislate in the early stages of this Parliament. I do agree that the decision on timing of a future bill needs to be taken in due course in the context of the Scottish Government's other legislative priorities. I do undertake that we will consider that decision very carefully. But I do not think, with all respect to the member who is quite rightly pressing me, fair enough, that you could decide just to have the sump legislation to tidy things up, and that would of necessity mean that that is what Parliament would do. And lastly, I would say there's nothing very simple about crofting law. There's nothing easy about crofting law. I think we've seen that in the Rhoda Grant, myself, Mr Rumbles, myself, and Mr Stevenson have seen that through the various previous efforts that very well-intentioned ministers have made of all administrations. There is nothing easy. There are no easy solutions that we find here. And to me, that argues for us to take the approach that I've advocated, that we try to develop, convener, if we can, a broad consensus in and out with this place before we decide which approach to take.
Okay. Mike, I'm going to bring you in, and then there's some questions on finance, which I'd like to wrap up with, if I may.
Thanks, Convener. Must be very pleased to say that I think you're doing absolutely the right approach to this from a governmental perspective, that you've got to take time to get this decision right, whether it's a blank sheet of paper you start with and restart the whole thing again, or whether you amend it. And I do understand that the government does have a huge amount of resources to get this right, but and will take time to do it, to present it for the committee and Parliament to examine. My only plea would be that I think that if we spend a great deal of time from a government perspective getting this right and then presenting the legislation, it's very important that the committee itself is not rushed, because the government takes such a long, perhaps a long time to present a bill, that the committee has also an appropriate period to examine it in detail to make sure that everybody gets this right, because we're all working for the same thing. And just to a plea for time, basically, on the Parliament side as well as the government side, if you see what I mean.
Well, I think I find myself in agreement with Mr Rumbles.
That's good. Is an agreement.
Is,
absolutely.
Very happy state to be in. It's not a daily occurrence, I don't think. But no, I think he's absolutely right. And, I undertake to work with the committee. I think the committee's role is valuable and the work that you're doing is useful. So I undertake to continue to work with the committee on this. I think that's the best approach. And I'm particularly keen to get a bipartisan approach across the political parties, if we possibly can.
Cabinet Secretary, I have three questions really on financial matters, if I may. One is with the budget coming up. The government's been good at supporting the Crofters Bull scheme, which I believe costs in the region of £250,000 a year to run, excluding capital costs. Is the Cabinet Secretary happy that that scheme will continue to run to the level that it has, with the investment it has post the budget that is shortly to be announced?
Well, I have been pleased to kind of take a lot of decisions on the loan scheme as quickly as possible. And that is because I think every loan granted to a single...
Did I not make
loan
it?
Scheme.
No, sorry, I meant the bull scheme. I'm
bull
pretty sure I said the bull scheme.
I'm sorry, I thought you said wrong. Loan scheme.
No, that's my next question. You can answer that one in a minute, if I may.
All right. Well, you know, I can't make any, and it would be wrong for me to make any undertakings about the budget. It's not for me to do. I think both the loan and the bull scheme play a valuable role, and of course we want to continue to do everything we can to support crofting. But I should also say that, and I'm well placed to say this, that we are under enormous financial pressure in the budget. If you look at the pressures that are coming our way in a diminution in our budget, I'm afraid that in my seat there are just not easy answers. And I don't mean this to be political. There are just a series of very difficult choices, Convener, to be made. And therefore I don't think it's really I don't think I can really be drawn. You may try, of course, but I don't think I can really be drawn into specifics, nor would it be right for me to do so, because all of these matters are quite properly the province of Mr Mackay's, the finance sector, in discussion with all cabinet secretaries. But I'm very pleased that we have been able to support the various schemes, and I was very pleased actually to visit one of the recipients of Crofting Loan who had completed his house, and I think it's a very effective, and sort of cost-efficient method of providing houses. There's not a great deal of bureaucracy or administration involved, although were mortgages to be available more easily and more readily to young people on crofts, then of course, you know, it actually might be easier to go ahead and to see even more young people build houses or obtain a house on the croft. That's what we want. We want repopulation, and it's not easy to achieve. So, you know, all these things will be borne into account in the decisions with regard to budget.
Cabinet Secretary, I understand that you would want to skirt around the edges of that, but I take your understanding and commitment that both the Bull scheme and the Crofting House grant scheme are both important, and that were it be possible that they should continue to the level they are. I understand that. Final question is, Cabinet Secretary, is to ask whether he believes that the Crofters Commission has sufficient resources to carry out the functions that you're asking them to do.
Well, obviously all public bodies require to optimise the use of finite resources. They need to be as efficient as possible. The Crofting Commission has already taken proactive action to improve organisational effectiveness. For example, they include the introduction of a new electronic case management system, the introduction of regulatory policies and delegated decision-making, some of those topics we've covered. So they have made progress, but like all public bodies, I think more progress will require to be made at a time of really very serious budget financial pressure. These aren't easy matters at all, but so far as I know, all the chief executives of public bodies are well aware of this and work with the Scottish Government in order to get the best results possible out of an increasingly reduced budget.
Cabinet Secretary, those are all the questions that we had for you. I wondered if there is anything that you would like to add, or anything that your team would like to add before I close this part of the meeting.
Well, it's not for me to say, but I do hope that we can work together, and expect that we will, over the issues in the way that Mr Rumbles suggested. I also hope that and this is really for the committee, so it's not meant to be cheeky, but I hope that some meetings can be perhaps held in the Crofting counties, perhaps in Stornoway or other places. Perhaps Gail Ross is looking very enthusiastic here. Perhaps our own constituency might be an appropriate location, because I think that, and I'm sure these are the sorts of things that committees have always done in the Scottish Parliament, but I think it would be very, very appropriate for that to be considered as the way in which we do our work, and that might allow evidence taking and so on from from ordinary individuals who generally will not, because of the geographical distance from this place, have their voices heard.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, thank you for those comments. And indeed, that last one about getting out and about was not cheeky at all. And it's part, when we consider the Island Bill, one of the things that we had on our agenda for looking to see if we could meet crofters. So thank you for that comment. And I'd like to thank all the witnesses for attending today's meeting. This is the committee's final plan meeting on its review of the legislative priorities for crofting. The committee will now consider the evidence it's heard and will write to the Scottish Government in due course. So thank you very much for attending today. I'd now like to suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of panels, and there will be a 5-minute comfort break for those members of the committee. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Dale, your pace. The fourth item on the agenda is the committee's first evidence session on the Scottish Government's forthcoming draft budget 2017-18. Today we're going to focus on forestry, and I'd like to welcome Stuart Goodall, the Chief Executive of CONFOR, John Hollingdale, the Chief Executive from the Community Woodland Association, Willie McGee, Coordinator of the Forest Policy Group, and Roddy Sherry, the Managing Director of Alba Trees Bleaku Estates. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting, and I can invite each of the witnesses to give a very brief outline of their respective roles and that of their organisations that they represent. And without being rude, if you could keep it as brief as possible so we can then get into our questions. If we'd like to start off with Stuart, because you just happen to be the first on the list, if that's all right, please, Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Convener. CONFOR is the principal representative body for the forestry and wood processing sector. We operate across the UK, but based in Scotland. We have 1,600 members, about half of which are based in Scotland, representing the full range of the supply chain in the forestry and wood processing sector. I describe it as a broad church. We've got everything from environmental NGOs, large forestry businesses, and sole traders. And we operate on the basis of having appointed members to a board, and from that board we agree our policy, and it's my responsibility to be representing that policy in places such as this. And I think the last thing just to point out is that in terms of both direct membership and indirect membership through the agents and the businesses working in the sector, we feel we represent the overwhelming majority of the forestry sector, the private forestry sector in Scotland.
Okay, John, would you like to?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I'm John Hollingdale. I'm CEO of the Community Woodlands Association, and we're a membership organisation established in 2003 by community woodland groups across Scotland, some of whom are very much older than we are. We have 175 members, located sort of middle of Edinburgh and Glasgow, right out to Western Isles, very north of Scotland. Great diversity of woodlands communities and activities, from small woods on the edge of town, focusing on recreation, to large commercial forest operations, particularly in the north and west, operating as social enterprises, so managing forests commercially, but then reinvesting those profits for social benefit, creating housing, setting up renewable schemes, and creating a lot of jobs.
Okay, Willie, if you'd like to.
Yeah, the Forest Policy Group is an independent think tank. We produce research pieces on local community forestry, deer, the types of woodland that Scotland has got and what it may need. We are very interested in local economy and in a diverse woodland portfolio, if you like, for Scotland. And I guess we would say that where Stuart badges, you know, a lot of forestry, we would represent the opinions of the, if you like, the small and medium-sized operators or owners.
Rodney, would you like?
Rodney Shearer, Managing Director of Alba Trees. Alba Trees is the largest container tree nursery in Great Britain. We are approximately 40% of all the container trees of the country. We produce about 140 different species, and that's spread over both commercial forestry and native-style forestry.
Perfect. There are a series of questions that we'd like to ask, and I will look to each of you to bring you in. If you don't want to answer or don't want to be called to answer on any of them, just don't catch my eye or go like that, and I'm very happy to pass you by. It's just that some people will want to give fuller answers, and there may be some areas that you don't want to actually answer on. So the first question, I believe, is myself. There we go. So, following up on the concerns expressed by the Raki Committee, does the panel think Forestry Commission Scotland can continue to deliver all of their requirements and responsibilities in the face of real-term budget reductions? And have you seen any impacts of these real-term reductions? Who would like to go first on that? Stuart.
I think it's quite clear that if the Forestry Commission is going to be delivering the objectives that the Scottish Government itself has said, then the budget will be insufficient. I mean, just to pick up a very specific point, on the planting side, there's a projected budget of £36 million for under woodland or forestry grant scheme, which is not just planting, but the bulk of it is planting, £30 million of that. And our calculation, if it's to achieve the 10,000 hectare a year target, which Scottish Government has said, then if we look at the average rate of grant which is being paid out, then we calculate it would require £45 million per annum in total. That's to achieve the 10,000 hectare a year target. If we look at it in the context of the previous government's objective of trying to achieve 100,000 hectares by 2022, which was something agreed with the agricultural community, the forestry community more generally, and the government at the time, we're falling behind in achievement of that objective. And in order to achieve that 100,000 hectare target, we would have to be planting 13,000 hectares a year, which would require an overall budget under the forestry grant headline of £59 million. So just in that one area alone, we're not, with the current budget, able to deliver the current government target, or we would see as the required target over the 10-year period.
Okay, thank you for that. Willie, I think you want to...
Did you mean Forestry Commission Scotland, or Forestry Commission Scotland and Forest Enterprise Scotland?
I think, I mean, it's always the difficulty of separating the requirements. I think what we're trying to identify is whether the forestry planting targets from the government can be met within the budget that's been allowed, okay, which I think is what Stuart was picked up on.
Yeah. I think certainly as an individual who bought land in September 2015 in the Borders, applied for a grant, got the grant through in 3 months, and that was in the teeth of a scheduled ancient monument and some environmental concerns. I think that one of the concerns I would have is that the Commission themselves, in terms of their staffing, is under pressure. I think we heard the Cabinet Secretary doing a marvellous job at obfuscating in the face of giving financial figures for government departments, but it's absorbed. I think Bob McIntosh started cutting posts and funding within the Forestry Commission in preparation, if you like, for austerity. I would certainly, my Forest Policy Group would certainly like to see the Forestry Commission and Forest Enterprise Scotland better resourced, not only to do things like restocking in Forest Enterprise, but in terms of enabling. Forestry Commission Scotland has always been an enabler. That means that they're able to give advice, to assist agents, to give guidance, and the time and the resources they've got just now are frankly not up to me. I would agree with Stuart's point about the actual absolute money terms, but I think the organisation itself needs to be well resourced.
I think I just endorse those 2 points, and a lot of our members have remarked on the apparent stress within the Forestry Commission staff, people being asked to do more with less resources.
If I'd pass comment on the planting targets, if the planting target is approximately 10,000 hectares a year, I think there's enough will in the private industry to meet that target, because at the present moment we have over 10,000 hectares of submitted options into the scheme. We have pre-submitted inquiries to the Forest Commission for a further 11,000. The biggest problem we've got right now is we've got 5,900 hectares which are now approved. And that 5,900 hectares has taken £27 million of the money. So there's absolutely no way the budget is going to meet to get up to 10,000 hectares. Once you get through, you know, first of all, we needed a will within the private industry to plant that number of trees. So I would say you have that. The second one is there enough money? That can be answered by whoever sets budgets. Practical detail you get after that. Because of the lack of continuity in the planting over the last few years, we've been losing people, losing employees in the forestry industry. The one thing we do need in our industry is continuity, so we can retrain people and bring people back in. So the whole labour issue as to whether we could plant 10,000, I think, would be answered by the private trade if we had continuity. Next step after that, is there enough trees? People like myself, you know, I'm one of 6 major nurseries in Scotland. We're trying to plan production of trees 2 or 3 years in advance of any schemes being approved. So for us, it's becoming increasingly difficult to be able to have the confidence to plan trees for the future. And we're getting to the point where we've just gone through a year where the nurseries in Scotland have destroyed approximately 3 million trees. We can't have another year like that.
Okay, and thank you for that. I mean, that's sort of leading into the next question, or a question further down the line. And I think the point made is that you're not, the staff are under pressure, the budget's under pressure, and we're not going to achieve the planting target. That's the general response from all, I think, is it? No one wants to add to that. Okay, fine. John, I think you're next.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like your views, please, on Forest Enterprise approach to the acquisition and sale of land. For instance, we were told in 2014 that it could be used to encourage new entrants into forestry. How's that panned out, please?
Yeah, well, if I could start the ball rolling on that one. Yes, Forest Enterprise are charged within the repositioning programme to sell, to raise money, to buy bare land. Ostensibly it was to meet climate change targets, and in the last iteration they were buying farms, which was relatively contentious, and there were new entrants, as in young tenant farmers in the lower lying land, and the forestry happening on the uplands or out by land. And the Forest Policy Group, we lobbied quite hard for some mechanism whereby you could have new forest owners, new forest tenants, new forest entrants, and I don't think it's not been achieved. I think it can be achieved, and I think the repositioning programme that the Cabinet Secretary is considering now, we don't know what the target is. Perhaps some of you do. 12 to 36,000 hectares of public forest estate to be sold off in the next 4 years to raise money to reclaim the mining sites that were left by bankrupt coal companies. That's the message that we've been getting. And we don't see that as a very good use of land. We think it could be better used in productive forestry, or productive native woodland or commercial forestry, whichever, and to encourage new entrants. So I think there is an opportunity, and I think that Forest Enterprise are a flexible and listening organisation. They're adaptable. And if they were instructed by government to encourage new entrants, they would do that.
I mean, repositioning, as Willie says, has been going on for some time, and we've been sympathetic with the principle of repositioning. I mean, at the end of the day, the public forest estate, or the National Forest Estate in Scotland, emerged out of the 20th century, and the objectives of the 20th century, and what a publicly owned forest should be seeking to deliver, which was primarily timber production. So fast forwarding into the 21st century, it does appear to make sense to say that a national forest estate is there to deliver a wider range of benefits, including stimulating the opportunity for new entrants, whether that's in forestry or farming. So, you know, we are sympathetic with that approach, and I think there are opportunities, including, for example, in farming, to provide for new entrants. I think the key thing for us is that when we're going through a process of repositioning, that the forests that are then sold, and primarily those are productive forests, they're not selling forests on the edge of towns which are important for local access. It tends to be forests which are primarily there to be producing wood. We know we've got a really difficult issue facing the sector in 20, 30, 40 years' time of a declining availability of wood, which is going to hit rural businesses in the forestry sector very hard. We are nervous that if you go down a repositioning programme and then you sell productive forests, and then those productive forests are lost, cleared, or not managed, then it means that we are draining the supply of wood available. And a significant component of the new planting that we're putting in place is to tackle that future lack of availability. Now, if we're not mindful of what happens with the forests that we sell, then we're making it even harder to achieve our new planting targets. So we support the principle. We think there are opportunities for it to both provide for new entrants. It is an opportunity to be investing in new woodland creation. It could happen in different ways. We'll have to see what comes out of it, as Willie says. But our plea would be the woodland that is sold shouldn't just be lost. It should be sold to somebody. We have an example in the community sector, North West Mall community, for example, who manage that forest, and it's supporting rural jobs, and it's putting wood into the basket of Scotland's forestry resource. So that's the kind of approach that we would like to see.
John, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, likewise, we're very supportive of the principle, and particularly the principle of the repositioning programme, that the receipts are retained within forestry for forestry purposes. And I think that was the critical step forward in 2005, rather than receipts just disappearing back off to the UK Treasury. So that's really important. Disposals have been an important trigger for community acquisition, and I think over the last decade, something like 4,000 hectares of disposals, which is 6 or 7% of the total, has gone into community hands. And those community bodies, as part of the process they go to, are required to demonstrate what their plans for future management are. And very, very often, that's more intensive management, bringing woods into management, doing more than Forest Enterprise would have been able to do. It would be an interesting step to place some of those requirements on all purchasers, because at the moment, if it goes to community hands, there is a requirement to have an appropriate management plan and a commitment from the community to deliver certain public benefits. The remainder that's sold into the private sector has no such requirement at all. Of course, some of it is bought by private sector companies that do manage those forests productively. I'm not making the case that all of them don't, but there is a risk that some will get lost. And it would be an interesting step, I think.
Ronnie, John, do you want to follow up on that?
Thanks very much indeed for that. Yeah, can I ask then about the income from sales? What use it's been put to, and do you think it's appropriate, or would you have other suggestions? Please.
Yep, Willie.
I've got very strong opinions about
love to hear them.
So, I mean, but previously, what I believe happened, I'm looking along at my learned colleagues here, when the Forest Enterprise disposed of 1,000 hectares on the west coast of Scotland, and then they bought a farm in Fife of 200 hectares, they then had, with the receipts, they then had to, that covered all the operations. So obviously the unit cost, the hectareage cost was higher for buying agricultural land, and they then had to fund the establishment of the forest out of the receipts. What's being proposed now is, as I said, that sites in central Scotland or Ayrshire that were abandoned by the likes of Scottish Coal or others who went down the tubes and left derelict sites, will essentially, what we're doing is we're selling rural forests, which may be of benefit to rural communities if they can get their hands on them. That's great. But then the receipts will go into, if you like, greening or reclaiming abandoned industrial land, which for those of us that have worked in the Central Belt know the unit costs are staggering. You know, to a forest, a piece of land in the central Scotland might be £20,000 per hectare. On the side of a hill in Caithness, it might be £2,000, or in the Borders or something like that. So what we've got is essentially the government signing, we think, signing up to do something quite barking.
Who will benefit from the greening, as you describe it, of these sites shamelessly abandoned by some of these coal companies, would view it as barking, though? If there were community benefits and communities adjacent to these sites
were seen to benefit. I wouldn't have a problem with it. But many of these sites, you know, if you go to places near Alloa, they're not actually adjacent to communities per se. They might be a few miles or more than 2 or 3 miles from the community. And it's not entirely obvious why, as government, you would pick up the tab for somebody else's failure to do something that might not benefit the community. I think you would want to look very carefully and consult with the local community about how they would want the money to be spent.
Would any of the panel...
Can I just see if I can bring in John, because I know you want to follow this up. I just want to see if anyone else has a particular point, because I think what you're suggesting is that it will achieve greening, but it won't achieve commercial timber. Is that right?
Or community buy-in. I think all too often money, as with the buying of farms, that was great for potentially climate change targets in the short term, but maybe not great value for money. But it didn't really necessarily benefit communities.
John, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to say what will be produced on, you know, if the greening of some of these sites goes ahead, because on a site-by-site basis, some of them will have land that was, you know, never mined in the first place, some that's been partially restored, some that's been barely restored at all, and clearly what you might be able to produce off those will vary greatly. In terms of community buy-in, again, I think that's a very case-by-case basis. I think on the acquisitions that have happened to date, I'm aware some certainly have had considerable community buy-in. Forest Enterprise bought a site outside Wick in Caithness, and I think the community have been involved in that process, and the feedback I've had is very positive. Whether that's a cost-efficient way of doing it, of achieving those public benefits, is a slightly different question, and I might reserve judgment on that in some cases.
Okay, before I bring Stuart in, John, do you want to add to that?
It was just maybe going to the acquisitions. I wonder, had any of the panel any concerns about any major acquisition, perhaps from a major landowner of forest?
The Forest Enterprise buying land from a major landowner. As in putting money in a landowner's pockets, is that what you mean? Yes, again, I think I might use John's more guarded word. You know, I think that would very much depend on a kind of landowner by landowner basis, who the land was acquired from and for how much. In essence, I would wish to see that kind of purchase operating under there's a new community asset transfer scheme, and in that scheme you do not have to buy at value. As far as I understand, you do not have to buy at valuation. If you can make a case that there are public benefits that flow from the acquisition, so a community wants to buy a bit of Forest Enterprise ground, and it's £1 million, you could buy for under that if you can demonstrate public benefits, and maybe that is a way of dealing with the landowner purchase.
Any disposals that were subsequently acquired?
Disposals of?
Disposal to a major landowner, then subsequently bought back?
No, I would be very interested to know about those.
Stuart, do you want to come in there? You were.
Yeah, I mean, just a few points to pick up on the things that have been said. I think the main principle, I think, comes down to the fact that you have both the forest that's being sold and then the land that's being purchased, and how you go about that and what it achieves. In terms of the land being sold, there's a general view that we want to retain that as forestry, that in the past there's been an option under the old National Forest Land Scheme whereby communities had an option to buy it first, and then there was a sort of nested arrangement of other organisations, and then it was private sale. And as John has said, there was no need to be specifying how that forest would be managed in a private sale. Whereas we're now moving forward with a new system being launched, our view is that there still should retain an option for a community buyout. There's an awful lot of very positives for that to achieve. Then beneath that, it should be open for sale, but there should be something in place to ensure that that forest is going to be managed as a forest, and it's going to be, you know, providing a productive outcome. That's what it was established for. It's there as an asset for the local community, for the, you know, the wider region. That should be retained in some way. So we feel that's important. You then come on to the issue of you buying the land and what kind of land and what it's for. And my perspective is that if we are looking at, well, one of the options may be greening former coal land, my understanding, as John says, is that's not necessarily just the spoil heaps themselves and the reconditioning of the land. It can also be land that wasn't damaged around it. And in that context, there may be an opportunity to grow some decent forestry. You know, mixed modern forestry, which is providing income, but also biodiversity and places for recreation. So I think a lot will come down to just what is being proposed on a case-by-case basis, and the public benefits can flow from that. So it's very difficult to say it's a good or a bad thing. It could be a good thing, and we would hope that if they go down the route of ensuring that there are real public benefits flowing out of it, that it will be a good thing, as long as we also look after the forest that was sold. So there's a net benefit, I think would be my summary.
Rodney, do you want to come in on that? Or?
I'm a horticulturist to trade as opposed to being a forester. And it depresses me at times when we always seem to fall into two camps. It's either commercial forestry or it's for community benefit. I really don't understand why the two just don't come together. You know, native trees can be productive, the same as commercial trees can create good habitats and good public access. That would be my only comment.
Rhoda, I think you wanted to ask a question on that. Sorry.
Yes, it was just the disparity of costs from the land, the coal mining land, to planting in Caithness. I mean, obviously there's clean-up costs, but why is that such a huge difference?
It's partly the state of the land and the ground preparation that you have to do in order to get that land suitable to grow trees. On many of these, certainly on mining sites, you have to either treat the soil or bring in new topsoil, or you're planting species that are going to be tolerant of the whatever it is in there, it's heavy metals or some sort of compounds that are hostile. Normally use a mixture of exotic trees like Alnus rubra, red alder, you know, in the central Scotland, the cost, and even in Edinburgh, if you go to Craigmillar or one of these community forests in Edinburgh, you'll find that planting costs may be anywhere between £7,500 and £15,000, depending on what you have to do to protect the site. And these industrial sites are very, very challenging. On a hillside, you're essentially, if you can protect from deer, and we don't really want to get into deer just quite but if you take them out of the equation, then planting costs are relatively modest. You know, you can be a couple of £1,000 per hectare. It's all to do with the preparation, the actual planting cost, and then the protection.
No, that's fair.
Can I just ask a question on the repositioning? My brief research shows that the forestry sales have been 4 times the amount of purchases in the last 4 years, and that the Scottish Government policy was to reposition woodlands, which allowed them to sell off bits that didn't quite fit within the portfolio to increase the tree cover. Do you think there's merit in ensuring, because I picked up on the point John had made about keeping receipts being used in forestry, and particularly in the land, I got the impression, on which the trees would be growing. Do you think there'd be merit in trying to get money reinvested in a shorter term, i.e. not sit on it for 4 years, or do you think that will create an artificial market in that when people see the forestry being sold, they'll know that they can bump up the price of bare land to get when the forestry have the cash to pay for it? I wondered if you have a view on that. Stuart?
I think there's a couple of points there. I mean, one is, as you say, the income has exceeded expenditure in recent years, and there is a banking up of money there. Part of it has been an issue, and it was maybe relevant to John Finney's question around the land being purchased, and are there controversies around that? And what we did see is there was quite an active program, of selling and buying land. But then it bumped up against agricultural concern about lost arable land in particular. And the original repositioning programme was intended to deliver planting across a range of land types. And the agricultural community were very upset when high-quality arable land was being purchased by the Forestry Commission to plant trees. That then resulted in the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group and a whole lot of discussions about what's an appropriate level of planting, that 100,000 hectare point I said earlier. But what it did then is it's put us a brake on buying land. So the repositioning programme was carrying on in terms of sales, but there wasn't the opportunity to deliver the land purchases. So that's part of why we've got the issue that we have. Then the second part of your question about if we then tighten up on that and make that work, what's the impacts of it? I mean, our feeling is that, yes, you do want to make sure that the money is reinvested in forestry, and some of the money has leaked out into supporting grants where we've had increased level of demand and there hasn't necessarily been the budget availability. I think all of us on the panel here, I think, will be in the favour of not leaking money out in that way, that government should provide the funding required for planting that is required for planting, and that there's a repositioning programme that should be recycled into forestry. And then that's done in a way to be delivering benefits which the private sector isn't able to deliver or better able to deliver. And that would then make less of an impact in terms of land prices. If you are then trying to deliver the same as the private sector is delivering, then what you'll create is additional demand for available land, which, if it becomes tighter availability, will drive prices up. So I think it is important that we look at how we complement things in order to get value for money for the public purse, but also make sure we deliver a wider variety of benefits.
Does anyone want to add? All the hands going up. John, you go first.
I may be wrong about this, but my impression was that there hadn't been a huge build-up of kind of money stored, that there's certainly more money received from selling land than is spent on buying land, but that gap is then, or what's in the middle, is spent largely on the woodland creation and the other works that go on with the new land. So you'd have to get someone from the Commission to give you the final numbers on those. I am aware that it has been difficult for FE to engage in the land market to acquire sites in a lot of cases, and I think there isn't a huge turnover of land sales in Scotland, and without that, trying to go in and find things to buy is very difficult. And I think in a tight market, in a market where a lot of people would think that the price of land is not reflected in its productive capacity, it makes it very difficult for FE to go and buy land at a price that really makes sense, it seems to me.
Willie, do you want to?
I think John has made most of my point. I was under the impression that they had, it was less sitting on money, but in some of the farm purchases, they've entered into arrangements with the likes of I'm not sure that it's Till Hill, but other private sector companies where they are contracting in to do the forest establishment. So certainly a portion of that money has been sitting waiting to go out the door into the actual establishment, into the trees themselves. And I think it will be interesting to see if repositioning goes ahead at the scale it does. Up till now, I think we've had about 50,000 hectares of public land from our forest estate sold. And if the Cabinet Secretary is minded to put 36,000 on the market in the next 4 years, that will mean that it bites deeply into what the public would see as more sensitive forests. There's no way around that. I mean, we've looked at some of the scoring systems with the Forestry Commission and Forest Enterprise, and you would have forests coming on the market which, if you like, would attract a lot more public attention than forest sales to date have done. So that's just something to bear in mind.
I think we'll leave repositioning, if that's all right, and move on to Mari's. I think you're next.
Thank you, Convener. Just going back to, I mean, the Raki Committee in 2014 had expressed concerns about the transparency, accessibility and the consultation around the processes around the sales and purchases of land from the Forestry Commission by Forest Enterprise. So it was really just to ask your opinions on that, and would you say that you are content with the transparency and accessibility and consultation around that, or would you make any changes to it? And if you would, what would they be?
I'm going to let John go first. I'll just get a change in order.
I think in terms of disposals, yes, I mean, there is a well-established system whereby disposals are lined up some way in advance. There's a degree of pre-notification which allows communities and others to know what's coming. You know what's in the pipeline for the next year or so. And clearly some forewarning is good, and there's a process by which communities are formally notified. Very occasionally on the ground it doesn't work quite so well because it goes through a community council, and that community council doesn't function particularly well, but you know, that's not really something that's I think a major issue. So the disposal side, I think the transparency and the accountability is fine once Forest is notified. I think in terms of acquisitions, inevitably, a lot of things get done with a requirement for commercial confidentiality, whether that's buying bare land or buying existing woodlands. And quite often that requirement for confidentiality is placed on the negotiation by the seller. It's not FC, or as far as I'm aware, who's the one requiring that. That's I guess a moot point, is if Forestry Commission is going to buy land from private individuals or private organisations, generally they will have the right to demand confidentiality. Whether that should be subject to someone else's scrutiny is, I guess, you know, for MSPs to decide rather than us to have a view on.
Willie, do you want to comment on that?
Again, John's answered fairly comprehensively. Forest Policy Group, we've been working with Forestry Commission Forest Enterprise for the last 4 years, and what we have done is we've been looking at their sales portfolio, and John has been part of this process, and even down to the simplest things like a great big sign at the end of the forest. We think they could do better in terms of transparency. Very simple things, not complicated or consultation processes, but just some notice in newspaper and sign at end of road kind of things. What we've been particularly interested in is sales where you have the potential to lot a forest. There is a big forest, it's covered in a road network. You have a community close by who could afford a bit of it, but not all of it. So we've been working with Forest Enterprise land agents to see if we can identify potential areas for local communities or small businesses, local businesses. We believe that one of the drivers in the next 5 to 10 years in forestry is going to be trying to get more local involvement in forests and local businesses. So John said everything I would have said about sales, about purchases. I don't see any way around that. So.
Stuart, do you want to? Mary, do you want to follow that up?
No, things like.
Okay, the next question is Richard.
Morning, gentlemen. So, forestry is contributing nearly £1 billion to the economy. Nearly 25,000, astounded me actually, 25,000 full-time jobs. But basically, you're saying that we're underplanting 17,000 hectares behind the annualised target. So we need to plant about 13,000 hectares each for the next of each year for 6 years. At least 9,000 of which has to be productive conifers. In a previous, I'm going to put you in the spotlight. A previous committee, the Raki committee, Conifer told the previous committee that the money available for the planting was insufficient, going so far as to call it pathetic. So in your response today, why would you still believe that planting targets, I know I've given you the answer, but why do you think planting targets still consistently are not being met, And do you still think the budget is pathetic?
Rodney's going to go first on that.
I wouldn't use the word pathetic because, you know, £27 million invested into forestry is not pathetic, but the overall budget, if the target is for 10,000 hectares and 31 million's there, if we're already up to 27 and we're on 5.9, it's just a fact it will not get to 10,000. It's just not possible. When you look at the breakdown of where the grant money goes, the only kind of efficiencies you've got is the type of forestry you invest in. If you invest in commercial forestry, that tends to be a lower price per hectare and you get more trees in the ground. But your forestry is a multi-objective, you know, so, you know, you're not just looking for commercial forestry, you are still looking for native type forestry as well. But the fact of the matter is native type forestry costs more per hectare.
Many years does it take for that, you know, just to inform people? You know, I love these adverts in the television that says we use, you know, for every paper towel we use, we'll plant 3 trees. You know, does that happen, and how long does it take for your average woodland in Scotland to grow to productive?
Well, commercial forestry, I think, first thinning's about 40 years and a full crop at about 70 to 80, I think, roughly speaking. But yes, when we plant trees back into an area which has been felled, what you have to realise now is that every area what gets felled now, the trees that go back in, it's, even in commercial forestry, it's not like a monoculture or Sitka spruce going back in. You know, we're paying attention to diversity of conifer species. So a fair proportion of what goes back in now will not be a commercial crop. You know, so if we plant 3 trees, but you plant 1 for environmental reasons, only 2 is going to contribute to your paper in the future. You know, and there is a price paying for that.
Stuart, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, and yes, we used the term pathetic before. We didn't use the term pathetic about the current round, and
previous committee. It's not one that we would perhaps strive to use in this committee.
I was going to make a serious point on top of that, which is that, yeah, I mean, you say pathetic because it gives you media coverage, but I think the serious point behind that is at the time we weren't convinced that there was the political support and the action being taken to deliver. So what we wanted to do was to raise the fact we thought was a fundamental problem. Now we're in a situation where we believe, with the current Cabinet Secretary in particular, there is a political understanding, and not just at that level. You know, we think in the intervening few years that you know, the MSPs on this committee, other MSPs that we speak to, appreciate and understand the issue that we're facing. So I do feel we're in a very different position. That's in terms of political awareness and appreciation. However, in terms of funding, it still there's an issue. Yeah, that if we are going to deliver the target we're aiming for, the funding available is insufficient, and that has to be addressed. Why is it not being met? You know, in the past it's not been met because one element is we're tied into, with forestry, an agricultural scheme. That changes every 7 years. You just look at what's happened in planting in the past, and it goes like a roller coaster. And it dips every time you come to a cap renegotiation period and pulls back up out of that because there's uncertainty of funding, there's a new scheme being brought in, there isn't predictability, which is one of the things that Rodney had referred to earlier. What we need to do is have a forestry scheme which is focused on delivering forestry planting and not tied into the whole cap process. That is possible, and we've asked for it, but there's been a reluctance to go down that route in the past. That would make a difference. And then we also need to broaden out and appeal to all the different types of landowners who want to plant. So that some of that will be large-scale planting, and that will be people generally buying land, and they're looking for a shorter processing period. And the Cabinet Secretary, we raised the issue around processing time. He appointed Jim McKinnon. He's reported to the Cabinet Secretary. We're waiting to hear back on that. But that's about speeding up the process so that somebody who's buying the land will know that they can plant that land and achieve that in a far shorter timescale, you know, 1 year rather than 3 years. But it's also to achieve the targets appealing to sheep farmers. It's appealing to estate owners, people who've got mixed use of land. And I think there's been an underappreciation of the financial benefit that can come from planting trees of all types. It's not just conifers, productive broadleaves as well. They can all benefit. And I think there's a greater understanding around that. And I think there's the opportunity as, over the next couple of years, uncertainty around CAP, Brexit, I think there'll be a lot more interest from sheep farmers and estate owners to be planting. That will help us. And then there's community woodlands and there's smaller scale forestry. All of that needs to come together to help us achieve that target. So along with the political support, with the funding being available and the communication of benefits, we'll definitely achieve the target.
Just before I bring you in, Willie, I think Gail's got a supplementary that sort of leads on to that, and then bring you in, and then I know there's more questions piling up.
Thanks, Convener. We're talking about planting targets, and I think we're focusing quite a lot on funding. Do you have any opinions on objections to planting proposals from either individuals or groups? And are there any improvements that could be made to the planning system to assess the targets being met?
Willie, I'm going to let Willie come in because he was queuing up to get in after that. I don't know if you can weave your answer around that and the previous question.
I think it will ever be thus. I think there will always be people who object, rightly and wrongly. My experience, I was director of Borders Forest Trust in managing something like 3,000 hectares in the Scottish borders, and there wasn't a day went by when we didn't have some input to new planting that we were doing. Ours was native woodland planting, so it doesn't often, sometimes it doesn't help, even if you're doing a different kind of planting. I think that the current process in terms of planning, it's slightly agreement with Stuart in terms of the rate of time it takes to go through a process if you have environmental impact assessments and you've got the local council who are coming in and making comment. We were putting a new road in, that took 3 months to get approval for that. But in terms of the absolute money terms, and I know you don't want this to go down the route of deer again, but a lot of the money that's in the grant scheme at the moment and a lot of the money that is expended in forestry is controlling deer. And if you took that out and it went into just planting trees alone, it would make a big difference. The deer fences go up when you are obliged to put native woodland or species that are not Sitka spruce in, so it is a major issue for forestry. And we would make better use of the money, and it would stretch a little bit further if we didn't have to put deer fences up at 13 quid a metre or whatever it is.
I'm sure we could delve into deer and whether we want to eradicate them from Scotland and whether they should be part of our native landscape. But I guess we're going to miss that one by because I think everyone's had their own opinion about biodiversity. But John, do you want to come in first? And then I'll bring Stuart, and then I'm going to bring Rhoda in.
Just a couple of points. Sitka spruce might be ready for harvest in 40 years, but some of the social and environmental benefits from that forest will be available and being delivered very much earlier. In terms of planting targets, I think there's general agreement of insufficiency of budget. Fundamentally, for whatever reason, landowners, individual landowners, aren't persuaded to make the decision to invest in forestry, unfortunately, despite the fact we have, I think most people would agree, actually quite high levels of grant in terms of pounds per hectare available. Partly that's to do with process issues. They've always been the case. Plenty of anecdotes going back over 20 years of some interesting objections that you get, and perhaps one of the answers is to empower Forestry Commission staff more to take a view, to be the experts who actually understand what's a reasonable level of objection and what's a spoiling objection. There are also some issues with cash flow, I think, which limit ability, the way that the grants are structured in terms of having to do the work and then get the money afterwards limits some landowners, in particularly community landowners, in being able to go down that route. And fundamentally, I think there needs to be more work to support and demonstrate the value of forestry to actually encourage those individual landowners to make the right decisions, or the decisions we want them to make. Because ultimately the Forestry Commission can't plant all this itself. It has the planting targets, but it's reliant on convincing individual private sector landowners.
Right. Just no, Richard, hold on. I was going to bring Stuart in.
Okay.
There is a queue,
Okay.
and I'll definitely get you in as soon as I can. So, Stuart, I'll give you a chance, if I may.
I'll try and answer it quickly. And I think consultation and engagement is hugely important. We're in a situation where what people see is the forests that are out there. What forests that are out there are what was planted 40 or more years ago. And they were planted against standards set by the government at the time, which was maximise production from an area of land. Whereas we now have modern forestry standards, which are about planting productive forests within a matrix of open ground, native species, broadleaf species, landscapes, open ground, all the rest of it. And that's all been accepted and supported by environmental organisations and many others. But we don't have those mature forests there to be able to present. So a lot of people are making judgments and have fear that what we're going to be doing is planting a monoculture, dark monoculture, square-edged on there, and that creates an issue. But what we're trying to do to overcome that is, and you know, as an industry we've taken responsibility on ourselves here, is to develop more evidence, to be starting to develop guidance which we're sharing with people who are putting forward new planting applications, so that they're aware of the benefits of engagement and how to engage with local communities and others to explain what modern forestry means, and also providing other evidence about the economic and jobs impact from that, not just the 25,000 jobs and 1 billion contribution to the Scottish economy, but if you plant an area of, say, marginal sheep farming, that you're going to deliver 4 times as much income to the landowner than you will from marginal sheep farming, and twice as much money into the local economy, and have more jobs. And there's been a perception in the past that if you plant, what you'll do is you'll destroy rural communities. And what we've been able to demonstrate, that's not the case. So there is a requirement on us to do that, which we're doing. But in terms of planning, I think it's also important that the Forestry Commission, as the authority here, do differentiate between what is a robust, real concern and what is sometimes, as John has sort of referred to, as sort of spoiling or a lack of understanding. And, you know, I don't like that. Well, yes, but that's not what we're actually going to deliver type situation where instead of responding simply, it can drag on. So I think we've got to have both the industry stepping up to the plate and engaging, communicating, and the Forestry Commission then being robust beside that and applying the process as it should be applied.
Ray, did you want to come in at that stage?
No.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to take Richard.
Just a small question. I take it that if the number of years it takes for a tree to grow, if we don't plant enough over the next number of years, we'll actually come to, and we're using £1 billion of that. And I take it we also still import quite a lot of wood and various other types of wood into the country. But if we don't plant enough over the next number of years, it will actually decline because we'll run out of producible wood.
Stuart, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much the case. I mean, Rodney had, earlier on had indicated that some of the plantings may take 60 years, but most of the productive planting, softwood planting, we're now looking at 35 years, 35 to 40 years of maturing. That still creates an issue whereby we're forecasting a falling away from 20 years' time. There are strategies that we can put in place to delay felling. We can look at mixing in faster growing trees. There are things that we can do, but fundamentally for us, it's not just for me today about saying we don't have the budget to hit the target. We've got to be taking all the actions to make sure that we actually do bring that planting through and that the funding then supports that to make that happen. Because if we don't, we're looking at a situation now, it's £1 billion. The sector is now looking at how it could become a £2 billion industry by the mid-20s. And there's a capacity to do that because we're still working with an increasing availability of wood. We're looking at how we add value. We can put more wood into housing, for example. Affordable housing is going to be a part of the Autumn Statement, we understand. Scotland provides an awful lot of the wood that's being used in housing across the UK. There's a huge opportunity for us. So we want to grow that, and then we want to maintain that level, which means we need to be delivering that planting.
To accumulate. Thank you, Convener.
Just, John, what I would like to do, if I may, is just widen this out a wee bit and bring Peter in on a question. But I'd just like to make a point to Willie. You'd mentioned DEAR, and I'm just going to make the observation to you. I call them sister committee, the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee actually are looking at deer management at the moment, as I'm sure you know. And they had a meeting with SNH on Tuesday. And specifically, one of the questions that came up was on deer fencing. So I know it's being looked at by them, which is why I'm not wanting to get too involved in that side, because they're looking at that. And I think legitimately we will get an input in that at that stage. So please understand your point has been accepted and is being dealt with. Now, if I could bring Peter in.
Thanks, Convener. As a farmer myself, I need to declare an interest, but surely one of the main drivers to achieve our targets is to encourage more farmers to get involved in forestry. And we all know that there's lots of stresses and strains between foresters and farmers, and it's often seen as a them and us situation. Now, Stuart has, spoken a bit about this conundrum, but there surely must be a better way that we can encourage more farmers to get involved in forestry as a sensible way forward, because at the end of the day, farmers control the vast bulk of land in Scotland still. So farmers must be an important part of solving this problem, and you have spoken a bit about it, Stuart, but I just encourage a wee bit more debate about this issue, because I think this is one of the most important ways that we can unlock the potential of forestry in Scotland. And we do know there's an issue. We're not planting enough. We need to do better.
I'm going to bring John in first of all, and then look to Rodney, see if he wants to add something, and then bring in. I want to try and balance, if I may, the input of you all. John.
I'd start by just making an observation that the 25,000 jobs and £1 billion industry is a very useful figure, and it was a very useful report. It's important to remember a large chunk of that is the other bits of forestry production, not just industrial sawmilling, and there's considerable potential for growth in the tourism and the related uses of forestry, and we want to encourage those as well. On the question of encouraging farmers, I think it's on the list of things that you wanted to talk about, which is, the long-term future post-Brexit. And I think one of the problems is the grant structure that we have that has agricultural grants and agricultural funding and forestry funding, and we don't have land use funding. And I think something that started from a land use strategy perspective and attempted to abolish that silo mentality a little bit in the grant structures, I think would be one way forward. That you started thinking, what's the best means for the Scottish Government to incentivise land managers to manage their land in the best interests of the economy and the people of Scotland, rather than having, this is an agricultural sort of silo with the money going this way and a set of grants that you're very well aware of, and then a forestry silo over here that is a different set of money to do a different set of things. And I think that's the opportunity for the future, perhaps, is to move away from that and design something based around incentivising land use in a particular area, in a particular river catchment or whatever that's assessed at a higher level.
Rodney, do you want to come in on that?
Well, so comment on the farming community. I definitely see the farming community tends not to be pro-trees, but I think a lot of that's well justified, because if they set trees onto land, it changes the use of that land forever. Quite often, if you put in a grant scheme and never wanting to bring that land back to agriculture, I think it's very difficult for them to do it. It affects land drainage. Our farmers have never been used to a culture of trees. They're used to annual crop production, etc. And when they think of 35 years, it's just alien to them. So I think there's quite an education process there if you are bringing the new generation of farmers through. you know, to try and treat trees as an agricultural crop, not as a forestry crop. You know, so I think it's quite an education thing within the industry. Yeah?
Okay, Willie, would you like to come in? Can I just say, there's quite a lot of questions here, and they're stacking up around me, and I would really appreciate if we could try and keep the answers quite succinct, and try, if I may, remind you that we're looking at this to try and influence our budget decisions. So I understand the wider policy is part of that, but if you can help us with finance and that sort of stuff, that's where we're trying to aim at. Sorry, Willie.
I don't think farmers are that much. Again, trees, my job was to speak to upland sheep farmers in the borders, not an easy gig for a forester. But if you approach it in the right way and you don't come with a message that you're going to lose half of your land and it's all going to go under one type of tree, but that you will have different uses and you can put some of your less good land under trees that might be useful for timber or for biomass, and that you can let your sheep back in there after a certain amount of time, there's no reason why farmers cannot play a key role in meeting targets. The big difference for us was that the Farm Woodland Premium Scheme paid £60 per hectare per annum for 15 years. The current scheme is your single farm payment. Now, if your single farm payment, if you're on a hill farm in the borders above 500 metres, might be £20 per hectare. That's not the same as £60 per hectare. So previously, if you had a holding of 500 hectares, you'd quite happily give up 100 hectares of it in patches, strategically placed. That's expensive. It's not as simple as just slapping a large Sitka plantation on it. I'm paraphrasing here, but you have to be more nuanced. You can do it, but you have to work with a farmer around where they can see that they can surrender ground to trees and what they'll get out of the trees, but the money is the key.
Stuart, do you want to, and then I'm going to bring Mike in.
I'll just to build on the point, we don't do Sitka plantations any longer, not for 25 years. But I think the important thing that's coming out is that, I mean, farmers need to be helped to understand what the opportunities are. I don't want to, it sounds a bit patronising. That's not what I intended to mean. But it's awareness of the opportunity, and we sort of lack examples and models of how that can be taken forward. There is some work going on. Forestry Commission have been good recently working with the National Sheep Association to try and encourage sheep farmers to come out and see where there have been integrated models of sheep farming and forestry, which demonstrate that you can put forestry onto part of your sheep farm and not actually reduce your meat production. You're still getting the same level of production, but you're also then getting an income from another source. And also a different type of income. So you've got your annual income from your sheep, and then you've got the opportunity for a capital investment when you're harvesting your trees. So I think we need to do more about demonstrating how those models can operate. And in terms of finance, I would also flag up that once that land is under trees, it's not then under the annual subsidy arrangement, so government's saving money. So you're able to work with the farmer in this circumstance and offer a situation where they're more economically active. They've got sheep production, so that deals with any issues around food security, and you're reducing the cost to the public exchequer. It just seems like a very obvious thing to do. We just need to help raise awareness of that.
Mike, do you want to come in on that?
I just want to make sure that I understand the fundamentals here. We're looking at the draft budget that's about to be published for next year. That's what this evidence session is about. And the Forestry Commission have told us that, as an example, over the last 5 years, if you take the average over the last 5 years, in Scotland we have failed. We've only reached 76% of the target the Scottish Government has set for new planting. So what you're saying, as far as I understand it, just correct me if I'm wrong, is the reason we haven't reached the target is that the government haven't provided enough financial incentive to reach these targets. First of all, is that correct? Is that what you're saying? And secondly, what is the point, asking more fundamental questions, what is the point of having Scottish Government targets of planting 10,000 hectares a year if on average we're only planting 7,600, and that's over a period of years. So what's the point of that? So we're focusing on the budget. Is this smoke and mirrors? Is this real? What's the future holding for us about this? There's a lot of fundamental questions here I'd like to be confirmed from you. Is my understanding correct?
No holds barred. You can answer that.
I'm very happy to be. I think it's important because it's a vital issue for us. It's not the lack of cash which has been the problem in not delivering the planting. The not delivering the planting has come down to a few reasons, some of which we touched on earlier. One is, as mentioned, the whole cap link profile, that when you go into a new cap negotiation period, it falls away because of uncertainty, change schemes, unavailability of a grant scheme, because you're changing from one thing to the next, and it takes a while to create a new grant scheme. So that all destroys confidence and activity. If we can move away from that assists. It's about providing the right signals to people who want to plant, that they can get approval within a year, 18 months, not 3.5 years. And if the Cabinet Secretary, advised by Jim McKinnon, comes up with action which delivers that, then that will make a huge difference as well. So I think the appeal for me is that it is achievable. As Rodney had said, there is starting to be the interest coming through. We're seeing more and more landowners saying that they believe forestry is a real opportunity. It does make a lot of sense. There's more people in the farming community doing it. The appeal for me is we believe we will see in the coming year more demand than had been perhaps predicted, and certainly in subsequent years. And therefore, we need to be looking at a situation that there's additional funding being made available, because if we're going to hit the target, it will be required, and we believe we will start to see the interest coming through.
John, do you agree?
Yes. I mean, I think the expectation is in the next couple, not particularly this financial year, but the next 2 years, that it will be much closer to 10,000 hectares. Whether it will catch up with what's, the lag is a different question. And it has been a lot to do with the process issues. It's perceived as being a difficult thing to do, to go through the system to create a significant area of new woodland. And so some of the measures, and Jim McKinnon's report and the recommendations from that, hopefully will make that appear to be a bit easier. But ultimately, there's a need to convince private individuals to change the land use on some or all of their holding. There isn't really an option for the Scottish Government directly to do this. Forestry Commission doesn't have the land to plant 10,000 hectares itself a year, and to go and buy that land and plant it would be unbelievably expensive. So its contribution has been 600, 700 out of the 10,000.
Okay, I'm just going to follow this right the way down, because I think it's a fundamental point. Rodney, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I certainly think within 18 months there will be enough applications in to meet 10,000 hectares a year. What worries me then is if it becomes oversubscribed, how do you then reject schemes from going ahead? Then if that rejection process then just takes away the confidence of the industry again. You know, if you get somebody who puts in a bona fide scheme, it's been approved from a technical point of view, but there's no money at that stage, and you tell them, no, you can't do it, that just knocks the guts out of the industry again. Eh?
And sorry, just to follow that on, has the industry got the capabilities to supply all the trees that are needed to achieve all this planting?
Well, within the nurseries, there is certainly enough capacity for 10,000. What we might not get is enough notification of the requirement, what they need. You know, that does worry me, that we might not have the right tree going into the right place, you know, which leads into, you know, the plant health questions and that you had.
We're coming on to plant health. Willie, can I just ask?
Yes to all that's been said. So your answer is there was enough money, there might not be in the future. But circling back to the farming, the real question in farming is about the rights of tenant farmers with woodlands. So I don't know what percentage of land in Scotland is under tenant farming, but as soon as a tenant farmer goes near woodlands, it becomes the landowner's prerogative, or has been the landowner's prerogative. So part of the answer to your question will be, how can tenants be empowered to get access to forest grants under some sort of landowner discretion scheme?
And Peter wants to come in on that, so perfectly brought in, Willie, well done.
I'm pleased you come back to farming, because I have the final bit that I would like to say is, obviously, we're going to design a new system to support agriculture in 2 years' time, Brexit. Surely that gives us a real opportunity, and I think it really does give us a real opportunity to design a system to support Scottish agriculture, which includes forestry within that system. And I think it's a win-win for all sides, and that's something that we need to strive to achieve. And I would, you know, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that's my thoughts on it.
I'm conscious of time, so if you agree there's opportunities, the answer is yes. And if you think there's no opportunities, the answer is no. So,
yes. Okay.
Stuart? Yes, John? Okay, so that seems to be yes. And that's as far as into Brexit that we're going to go just at the moment. John has now got a question on to follow on.
Yes, well, a different area really completely, I think. I mean, I should say perhaps that I'm a city MSP. I have very few trees and forests in my constituency, slightly more than we have crofts anyway. But the whole question of pests and diseases, so this is a genuine question because I don't know the answer, but do we have a problem with pests and diseases in Scotland?
The two which will come possibly to the public's mind would be the ash disease, which means that ash can't be planted in Britain, and the second one would be red band needle blight in pine. The biggest problem we have in pest and disease is not the pests which we actually know, it's the ones we don't know. So the main route for pest and disease coming into the country, it's not that they're indigenous diseases and because of climate change they've started to spread more. The main route for pest and disease coming in is actually through importation of plants.
And is that done through nurseries or is that done through other people?
It tends to be through nurseries.
Right. And how
there is some buyers as well.
Right.
The reason nurseries will import trees is because they don't have the confidence to produce what they believe to be the full requirement of trees for the period going forward. You know, so nurseries will tend to maybe produce 80% of the requirement, then rely on imports for 20% of production. And that's just purely a confidence thing, yeah.
Are nurseries able to handle the pests and diseases, or do they need input from the Forestry Commission as well?
No, we get input. We get input from the Horticultural Marketing Unit. That's where the main input comes from. That's the Plant Inspectorate of Scotland, and you know that means that all commercial nurseries are inspected for plant health and disease, and that's a full cost recovery system, where we pay for the privilege of being inspected. The biggest issue you've got in Scotland on plant health and disease would actually be from the public themselves in the purchase of plants through garden centres. The same pest and disease can come on into plants and garden centres, and the control there is much more difficult to police.
And that can then affect forests?
It certainly can. The biggest one coming to us in the future is a disease called Xylella, which is now in Italy. It first came in vines, which destroyed the vine crops. It then transferred across to dates, to olives, sorry. And now they've found at least 300 different host species now. So that's a major concern on importation of plants, because that's covering a wide variety of the types of material which is imported through garden centres. But education is the key in that. You know, try and educate the public that they shouldn't be buying these type of plants.
Does anyone want to add anything to that, Willie?
Rodney's quite correct. I think it was the SOD, sudden oak death, came in through azaleas, was it? Or that were imported from California. Yeah. It didn't tackle oak in the first instance, but managed to jump to, eventually, is it larch, the Phytophthora. So what we've got now in southwest Scotland is almost a larch-free zone. And as Rodney said, we can't plant larch back into some places in Scotland.
The vast majority of Forest Commission's budget on plant health is actually removing larch.
Removing larch, yeah.
Felling larch.
Yeah. So in terms of what we do, Rodney's quite right. It's public education and awareness, but in terms of looking at the tree species that we use, and this isn't quite a dig at Stuart here, but in terms of Sitka and productive forestry, we need to be talking to the millers and the buyers of timber to get them educated in a wide range of types of wood that they can use, just because we don't know. We don't know what's going to come in next. Well, Rodney does in some instances.
I'm just going to bring John back in to add before I ask Stuart and John to...
Yes. I mean, where our as has been said already, we're focusing on the budget and therefore what we should be encouraging the government to do more. So, I mean, I'm wondering, I mean, public education is quite a wide one. It's quite a difficult one to tackle. But should the Forestry Commission, and from what I understand, is it the Plant Health Service that they have, I mean, should they be doing the more? Have they got the resources to tackle some of these things and presumably to do education along with research?
Have in Scotland is you've got the Scottish Plant Health Strategy, and that's Plant Health, Agricultural Department, the Forestry Commission and Scottish National Heritage, and they have quarterly liaison meetings, and they do communicate well together. There is good, you know, cross-department communications there, but the actual budget they have either falls into research and development with the Forestry Commission for pest and disease, or, like I say, it falls to the Horticultural Marketing Unit, where that's self-funded anyway. You know, so it doesn't cost. It doesn't cost the government any money to police that. What we need is confidence in plant supply, so we don't choose to import trees, and awareness of our customers that there's a major risk in importing trees. So don't even ask for them.
Yes, in particular on the sort of budgetary side of it, but I mean border control is a significant issue. We need to be looking at borders. Some are airborne, for example, but a lot of it is imported, and it's how we police our borders in terms of phytosanitary issues. In terms of budgetary issues, I'd flag up that it's very important forest research play a key role in this, and it's relevant in the upcoming consultation which is just completed around the future of the Forestry Commission in Scotland, which is having a cross-border forest research. We have a cross-border function there, and very often on tree disease we have one expert, and that covers the whole of GB or UK. And if you decide that you're going to have 3 separate forest researches, then you're going to have to find some way of cutting somebody in 3 and maintaining the bit that can tell you what's going on. So we need to have that collaboration. Also, we need to look at how we operate the grant schemes and what we're funding. And there was Willie's point about diversification, and it may be a surprise to Willie, it's not a surprise to me, that the sector has looked at this and is aware of it as an issue. But what's key is that anything which is done at scale, we're looking at planting forestry at scale, you're using products in sawmills at scale, therefore you need to be ensuring that you are planting tree species which are going to be able to be harvested at scale and which are suitable for market. And that can be done, but some of what the work that has been done in the past has sort of been saying diversification is the way forward just for the sake of diversification without actually thinking about end product. But that's something we are improving.
If you have pests and diseases, is diversification a good thing? Does that kind of slow them down or hold them up?
Well, diversification is basically about risk. You know, if you've got a broader range of species, you're reducing the impact of one. But a corollary to that is yeah, if you've got more tree species, then you've got more trees which could be affected by wide ranges of diseases. So I think it is a balanced risk approach, and that's something that in the private sector that we've been very hard to get, be putting over in the last couple of years, is because we have seen some of the policy responses being quite simplistic, and we need something which is actually more long-term and more robust.
Come in there.
Yeah, just briefly, the Forestry Commission has invested money in citizen science projects to enlist members of the public, a great many of whom go to woods very often, are very interested in what they see, to record and report symptoms of diseases, and that's proved to be quite an effective way of monitoring the spread of diseases that are already here. I don't think it's possible for Forestry Commission to be regulating garden centres, and unfortunately that needs to be somebody else's job. In terms of the budget issue, I think the budget is sufficient for exactly where we are now. The danger is that we're in a world that's very uncertain. No one quite knows when the next big disease will strike and what species it will strike, but we're increasingly certain that there will be something coming down the line in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years' time.
It is.
Yeah.
Is it not as clear-cut as that?
It's not as clear-cut as that. Sometimes you see these things coming, but I'm not sure that everything that struck us in the last 2 or 3 years was predicted up front. I don't think cholera was flagged in quite the same way. Or if it was, I missed it, and a lot of other people missed it. And if touch wood, it doesn't happen, but if some major disease happens and it strikes Sitka spruce, then there will be very major kind of cost issues involved in that.
It's definitely the disease we don't know about. It's the one which is the biggest risk. Yes. You know, and ash disease was one where we did actually know about it. We first knew about it in 1999, but the legislation and plant phytosanitary certificates and that took a long time to catch up with the disease. Therefore, we still imported trees, even though we knew the disease was in Europe. The whole diversity issue, out in a forest, I would say that diversity of species and that should help to reduce the incident of pest and disease. But the type of diversity we're planning just now is the introduction of new species from other parts of the world. We don't know the problem that lies with some of them. So quite a bit of that diversity has been done to combat climate change, where we're recommended to grow plants from 2 degrees further south, 5 degrees further south. I would say that that policy is not really looked at wide enough to see the risk involved in that. You know, I really think in Scotland we should be sticking to the use of our own native species and not relying on some of these new exotic species that are intended to reduce.
And I think that message and the message of giving confidence that there's a long-term future for forestry will give some strength. Now, the next question is Rhoda, I think.
We're all aware of an up-and-coming forestry bill, and I was wondering what your thoughts would be about the cost implications of that. Is it going to have a budgetary impact? Is it going to save money, or is it going to cost us money?
Willie, I'll let you go first because you're looking perplexed.
No, it was the budgetary implications and crystal ball gazing. Well, as we understand it, the forestry bill, first of all, from a forestry policy group perspective, could be a very exciting and dynamic thing for Scotland's forests. What we've been led to believe is that it will be the mechanism whereby not only is forestry devolved, but forest enterprise then becomes part of forestry and land, along with the Crown Estates land and SNH's national nature reserves. Sorry? Not in the short term. All right, okay. So this is crystal ball gazing now then. But anyway, that doesn't strike me as having a great cost implication or a budgetary implication, except for the rebranding exercises, and we all know how expensive rebranding exercises can be. So I think that would be beholding on the committee to keep a very close eye on that. Forestry Commission Scotland, which will inevitably end up somewhere else, and I think you'll get a diversity of views on the panel here. We in the Forest Policy Group would like Forestry Commission Scotland to retain its enabling, flexible, community-friendly, forestry, local development-friendly role. We don't see that being best served by stuffing it into the Environment Division in Victoria Quay, where they will become humdrum civil servants without the flexibility that we would like. I don't think that's got very much of a cost implication, except, again, for the rebranding. We would wish to see Forestry Commission Scotland retained as an arm's length with an oversight body, an oversight committee, like the National Committee, what John Hollingdale sits on. And that may have a cost implication, but I'm not sure that I'd be able to say too much about that.
Stuart.
Yes, I mean, I pick up Willie's point. You know, rebranding exercises, there's always an issue around that, and that might raise something, but will it in itself necessarily create budgetary issues? I mean, it's not clear that it will. You know, I think we have a similar understanding in terms of what is intended to happen. I think one thing which is less a budgetary issue, but is very important about delivering policy is, and Willie alluded to it, is what you do with the facilitating, supporting, promoting element of Forestry Commission as it's described. And certainly we wouldn't want them to become humdrum civil servants. I think that would be a step back. And we have made very clear in our response to the consultation that while we believe it does make sense that you have a body of civil servants, and they are civil servants, who are there to be, you know, operating with expertise to work with and support the sector, that expertise and that ability, that remit should continue. But we feel that by being part of the Forestry Environment Director, as it currently is, or the Environment Forestry Directorate, that looking forward to Brexit, all the changes that are coming up, we want forestry to be the heart of government thinking, government policy, and therefore our feeling is that by forestry being a key part of the Scottish Government, it will support and enable that. We are very nervous about the idea that forestry has been a silo in the past. It's struggled to break out of that and be seen to be part of rural policy and wider government delivery of policy across the board, and that if we try and hide it away again and set it up as a sort of an arm's length organisation, that we're missing that opportunity. So I think in policy terms, what's being proposed, as long as we retain that forestry expertise and that remit that Willie talked about and those type of people, it could be a win-win.
John, could I ask you if you want to add anything, but I'm going to try and urge you to be as brief as possible.
I'll be very brief. It's very difficult to see where any cost savings would come, either in the Forestry Commission part or the Forest Enterprise part, unless you cut delivery of public benefits. I think both parts of Forestry Commission have significant value to the public, and I don't see how you trim that. And we're very concerned, as the other panel members have said, about the cost of a rebranding exercise. We hear anecdotally numbers of the costs of the rebranding in Wales and the reorganisation there, and would be concerned about where the money would be found. Would it come out of Forestry Commission budgets to rebrand, etc.? That would be a major loss, I think.
Okay. Rodney, is there anything?
I would look at the experience, what's happened down in England. You did have a Forest Commission in England and Wales. They seem to have rebranded themselves to the point of non-existence, and they managed to approve 282 hectares of forestry. So I think it's been a bit of a failure down there. So I'd like to see them retain the forestry expertise up here.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that is the end of our questions. I just wondered if anyone feels that there's something that they want to say very succinctly that they haven't been asked on relating to this coming budget and anything we should be considering that we haven't raised. Willie, is there anything you want to say? And succinctly, please.
You've mentioned deer, and there will be a meeting in here, I think, on the 8th or something of December with the Environment Committee. But in terms of budget, I would urge the committee to bear in mind that the Forestry Commission has been one of the drivers of rural development and land reform in Scotland. A lot of the land that is now in community ownership has come through Forestry Commission, and to smile kindly on the Commission.
Stuart.
In that spirit, I think the main thing is just to reiterate that the planting is one element of a wider budget, and what we wouldn't like to see is the planting budget being increased at the expense of the other activities the Forestry Commission undertake, because it includes other things like Scottish Timber Transport, the Central Scotland Green Network, the things we talk about, plant health. There's a lot in there which is important. We have seen reductions in the capacity of the Forestry Commission, and therefore we feel that, as we hope to see an increase in demand, therefore, for the planting budget, that's satisfied by looking at the budget as a whole, not by robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Stuart, I think you could be a good politician if that was succinct, but thank you for the points you made. John, could I ask you, please?
I will be absolutely succinct. Stuart said exactly what I would have said. We want to see woodland creation, but not at the expense of the other budgets.
Rodney.
I wouldn't underestimate that the industry is quite appreciative of the political support we get in Scotland, because compared to the rest of the UK, at least forestry is a major industry. And you do have decent aspirations.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming. If I can just make an observation that when we sat down and worked out our work schedule at the beginning of the year, forestry was right up there on the things that we wanted to look at, which is exactly why we have asked you to come and help us when we're to consider the budget. And I absolutely believe the committee will be looking to you next year to see how the budget is delivering, because it is important to every single member of the committee. So thank you very much for coming and sparing the time. I would ask you, if I may, without being rude, we have one more item of business, and you may want to extract yourself quickly to do that. Sorry, and I'm going to suspend the meeting very briefly before we go on to that. Thank you very much. I'd like to move to agenda item 5, Tenant Farming Commissioner. We are to decide whether to appoint one of our members as a reporter to participate in the meetings of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, where the appointment of the Tenant Farmer Commissioner will be considered. There is a paper on this, and the paper outlines the potential role of the nominated representative of this committee to be involved in the appointment of the Tenant Farmer Commissioner and to represent the committee's interest at the meeting of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee. I wondered, firstly, if anyone had any comments on that or whether there were any nominations. Stuart.
I think it's probably important that we do get involved in this. It is, of course, about selecting a person, so I hope that we choose someone with an appropriate background in man management and expertise, not looking at anyone in particular, convener.
Does anyone have any other comments? Well, does anyone have any nominations, or would anyone like to put their name forward?
I think that Stuart Stevenson is absolutely right, and with your agreement, convener, I would like to nominate Edward Mountain, MSP.
Well, I have to ask if anyone would think that they would rather do it than me. I'm very happy to do it if anyone else would rather.
Amen. Acclamation.
Okay, so I'm pleased to confirm that I have been appointed to attend the meeting of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee on the 29th of November. Now, that formally concludes our business, but I would ask you just to stay seated for a moment to conclude one or two matters in private afterwards. Thank you very much, and that concludes the meeting.
Thank you.